I am Alida Bush, and I am 29 years old. 3 days ago, my father passed away from a sudden heart attack. Today, my family gathered to bury him in the frozen ground of Anchorage, Alaska. We thought we were laying to rest a devoted husband and a legendary freight tycoon. But halfway through the eulogy, the heavy oak doors of the church swung open. A woman in a designer silk coat marched right up to the casket with her 2 adult children and a slick Seattle lawyer. She looked my grieving mother dead in the eye and said, "I am his legal wife." My mother tried to have her thrown out. After all, my parents had been married for 35 years. But the woman was not lying. Her lawyer pulled out a sealed 1993 divorce decree and a brand new will dated just 1 week before his death. My mother realized her entire existence had been legally erased decades ago. When she collapsed onto the freezing stone floor, my older brother did not even try to catch her. How old are you, and where are you watching from today? Drop your age and location in the comments below. Welcome to Sophia Told Stories. Please hit that like and subscribe button if you have ever had your reality shattered by the people you trusted most. You will definitely want to stick around to see how I handled the ultimate betrayal. Now let me take you back to the bitter chill of that Tuesday morning inside St. Jude Sanctuary, and the moment my family fractured forever. The stained glass windows rattled against a -20-degree wind. The sound echoed through the high ceilings like frozen bones clicking together. I stood in the front pew, staring at the polished mahogany casket, holding my father, Richard Bush. The air inside the building smelled of melting snow, damp wool, and the bitter pine wreaths arranged near the altar. My mother, Susan, leaned heavily against my shoulder. She had barely spoken a word since the paramedics called the time of death. On her other side stood my older brother, Connor. He kept checking his expensive watch under the cuff of his tailored suit, while his wife, Jessica, adjusted the collar of her extravagant fur coat. Connor was the vice president of operations for Bush Freight and Aviation. He spent his days in heated boardrooms making corporate decisions. I coordinated the wilderness logistics. I spent my days on the harsh tundra, making sure our cargo planes did not freeze to remote runways. We grieved differently. He checked the time while I watched the ice crusting the window panes. The priest raised his hands to deliver the final blessing. That was when the heavy doors at the back of the room opened. A gust of Arctic air swept down the center aisle, extinguishing the altar candles in an instant. Footsteps echoed against the slate floor, sharp and deliberate. 3 strangers walked toward us. The woman leading them wore a thin black silk coat. She was trembling in the draft, but kept her chin raised high. Her stilettos clicked a steady rhythm, indicating she did not care about interrupting our grief. Beside her walked a young man in his early 20s, wearing Italian leather shoes ruined by the salted pavement outside. A young woman flanked her other side, tapping a manicured fingernail against a designer clutch purse. They stopped right next to our pew. "Excuse me," the priest said, lowering his hands. "We are in the middle of a service." "I know," the woman replied. Her voice carried a polished Seattle cadence sharp enough to cut the chill in the room. "I am here to bury my husband." A low murmur rippled through the congregation. Connor stepped forward, his jaw tight. "Lady, you have the wrong funeral. My father is in that casket." "Richard Bush," she stated, locking eyes with him. "Yes, I am Valerie. We have been legally married since 1994. My mother flinched as if struck across the face. "Richard and I have been married for 3 decades. Get this crazy person out of here." A man stepped out from the shadows near the vestibule. He was a lawyer, judging by the pristine briefcase and his calculated, neutral expression. He approached the casket and unsnapped the leather latch of his bag. "I am afraid Valerie is telling the truth," the lawyer said. He pulled a crisp, heavy folder from his bag. "I carry a sealed Nevada divorce decree dated October 1993. Richard filed it quietly to protect corporate assets during a state tax audit. He divorced you, Susan. The paperwork is finalized, signed, and filed." The air left my lungs. October 1993. I was 2 years old. My father had lived in our house, eaten at our dinner table, and built his freight empire while letting my mother believe she was still his wife. He lived a double life for my entire existence. That is a lie, Connor hissed, but his eyes darted nervously to the gold legal seal on the document. It is a matter of public record, though buried well, the lawyer continued. His tone was clinical, devoid of any human empathy. Furthermore, I carry his final will and testament, dated exactly 1 week prior to his passing. Our family attorney, an old friend named Harrison, pushed through the crowd. He snatched the papers from the Seattle lawyer. Harrison adjusted his glasses, his eyes darting across the paragraphs. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin as gray as the winter sky outside. "Harrison," my mother whispered. Her voice was trembling. "Tell them they are lying." Harrison looked up. He could not meet her gaze. "Susan, the signature is verified." He left the company to Valerie. My mother let out a sound I had never heard before. It was a hollow, jagged gasp. Her knees buckled under the weight of the betrayal. I caught her before she hit the freezing stone, pulling her dead weight against my chest. Connor froze, staring blankly at the new will in Harrison's hands. Jessica took a step away from us, protecting her expensive coat from the unfolding scene. I knelt on the cold floor, holding the woman whose entire life had just been erased with a pen stroke. I looked up. Valerie stood over us. A faint smile played on her lips. She did not look at the casket. She looked at the empire she had just claimed. This was not just an interruption. It was a hostile takeover. Valerie did not come to mourn the man who built Bush Freight and Aviation. She came to claim the keys to the kingdom. My father had built a logistics empire that kept half of Alaska alive during the bitter winters. Now this woman, in stilettos, thought she owned it all. "Look at her," Brianna sneered, gesturing toward my mother. She really had no idea. Trenton smirked, brushing salt off his Italian shoes. Dad always said the Alaskan branch of the family was a bit slow to catch on. The sheer cruelty of the statement hit me like a physical blow. Dad. They called him Dad. While I was out in the freezing rain checking landing gear and securing cargo, my father was flying down to Seattle to play house with these people. Connor finally found his voice. "You cannot just walk in here and take our company. I am the vice president of operations." "Not anymore," Valerie said smoothly. "The new will leaves 90% of the business to me and my children. You are merely an employee now, Connor, an employee whose position is under review." Harrison stepped between us, holding up his hands to quiet the rising panic in the church. "This is neither the time nor the place. We will reconvene at my office tomorrow morning to review these documents formally. Until then, this service is over." Valerie turned on her heel. "Tomorrow morning, then. Do not be late. We have a lot of changes to make." She walked out of the sanctuary, her children and her lawyer trailing behind her. The cold wind howled through the open doors, matching the ice forming in my chest. My father had betrayed us. My mother was broken. My brother was already calculating his next move to save his own skin, and I was left holding the pieces. But Valerie made one crucial mistake. She assumed I was just a rugged wilderness coordinator who did not understand the corporate game. She thought she could march into my territory and take what belonged to the North. She had no idea what kind of storm she just walked into. The next morning, the reality of the situation solidified inside the mahogany-paneled conference room of Harrison's downtown law firm. The air felt heavy, smelling of stale coffee and leather bindings. Outside the frost-covered windows, Anchorage was waking up to another brutal winter day. But inside, the temperature was even colder. My mother sat rigidly in a high-backed chair. She stared straight ahead, her hands clasped so tightly in her lap, her knuckles were white. She had not slept. She had not eaten. She looked like a ghost, haunting her own life. Connor sat next to her, tapping a gold pen against a legal pad. He was already wearing his corporate armor, a tailored charcoal suit, his tie perfectly knotted. Jessica was conspicuously absent, claiming she needed a spa day to recover from the emotional trauma of the funeral. Across the long, polished table sat the new dynasty. Valerie occupied the center chair, radiating a smug entitlement that made my skin crawl. She was scrolling on her phone, letting out an exasperated sigh. "I cannot believe the cellular service in this state," she complained loudly to her Seattle lawyer. "We might as well be on the moon. It is barbaric." She was casually dismissing my home while preparing to dismantle my family. Trenton lounged in his chair, checking his reflection in the dark screen of a tablet, while Brianna meticulously applied a fresh layer of lip gloss. They looked incredibly bored, as if destroying a family was just an annoying chore on their itinerary. Harrison cleared his throat, attempting to establish order. "We are here to formally read the final will and testament of Richard Matthew Bush. The document executed in Nevada supersedes any prior arrangements." He began reading the dense legal jargon, but the core message was painfully clear. My father had spent decades building Bush Freight and Aviation. It was a $50 million empire essential to the Alaskan supply chain. The new will distributed the entire operation with ruthless efficiency. 90% of the holding company, including all corporate branding, operational licenses, and immediate revenue streams, was left directly to Valerie Trenton and Brianna. They were the new majority shareholders. Harrison turned a page, his voice tight. "To my son, Connor Bush, I leave his current position as Vice President of Operations, along with his vested stock options and executive compensation package, provided he maintains his duties to the satisfaction of the new board." Connor exhaled a long breath, a sound of profound relief. He stopped tapping the pen. He was safe. His six-figure salary, his country club memberships, his pristine corporate life was insulated from the fallout. He looked across the table at Valerie and offered a brief, acknowledging nod. A sickening realization began to form in my gut, but I pushed it down. Harrison hesitated before continuing, his eyes dropping to the bottom of the page to Susan. He started, then swallowed hard. "To Susan, the will stipulates a 30-day transition period. You are required to vacate the primary mountain residence. A modest relocation stipend will be provided." 30 days. My mother had designed that house. She had planted the spruce trees lining the driveway. She had hosted every corporate holiday party for 3 decades. Now she was legally reduced to a former domestic partner, being evicted with a small severance check. She did not cry. She simply nodded, once a jerky, mechanical motion of a woman whose spirit had been broken. And finally, Harrison said, looking directly at me, "To my daughter, Alida Bush, I leave the contents of the safe deposit box associated with this key." He reached into his briefcase and pulled out a weathered, yellowed envelope. He slid it across the long, polished table. The sound of the paper scraping against the wood was the only noise in the room. It stopped right in front of me. I did not reach for it immediately. I could feel the eyes of everyone in the room burning into me. Connor looked away, pretending to study his blank legal pad. My mother remained motionless. I picked up the envelope. It was surprisingly light. The paper was brittle, indicating it had been sealed for a long time. I opened the flap. Inside was a small, heavy object wrapped in a piece of faded canvas. I unwrapped it carefully. It was a brass, bush-plane compass. The metal was tarnished green with age, and the glass cover was cracked. A small brass key was taped to the back of the casing. That was it. No trust fund. No stock options, no property deeds, just a rusted piece of old aviation equipment and a key. Valerie leaned forward, bracing her elbows on the mahogany table. She looked at the compass and let out a sharp, cruel laugh. "Well," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "I suppose Richard always knew you belonged out in the wilderness with the rest of the animals. He left his mountain goat daughter a toy to play with in the snow." Brianna giggled, covering her mouth with a manicured hand. "Honestly, it is fitting," she sneered. "You coordinate logistics right. Maybe you can use that old thing to find your way to the unemployment line. I hear the job market up here is brutal this time of year." Trenton snickered, elbowing his sister. "I doubt she even knows how to use it. Probably relies on GPS like everyone else." The humiliation was designed to crush me. I was the rugged tomboy, the daughter who spent her weekends turning wrenches on frozen engine blocks instead of attending corporate galas. They saw me as the grunt worker, the disposable part of the machine. They thought they had won. They thought I was beaten. But they did not know my father. Not the man I knew. Richard Bush was a lot of things. He was secretive. He was calculating. He was clearly capable of profound deception. But he was also meticulous. He was an engineer by trade, a man who never wasted a single motion or left a detail unexamined. He built a logistics empire in the most unforgiving environment on Earth because he always had a backup plan. He always accounted for the variables. I stared down at the rusted compass resting in my calloused hands. The needle was stuck, not pointing north, but jammed hard to the side. I ran my thumb over the tarnished brass, feeling the faint grooves etched into the metal. It was not a toy, it was a tool. I remained perfectly silent. I did not rise to the bait. I did not yell or demand an explanation. I absorbed the mockery, letting their arrogant laughter wash over me. I carefully wrapped the compass back in the canvas and slid it into my heavy coat pocket. "Are we finished here?" I asked, looking directly at Harrison. The lawyer nodded, looking miserable. "Yes, Alida." That concludes the reading. I stood up, the legs of my chair scraping loudly against the floor. I walked over to my mother and gently took her arm. "Come on, Mom. Let's go home. We have packing to do." Valerie watched us leave, her smile triumphant. "Make sure you leave the appliances," she called out. "I am having the interior decorators fly up from Seattle next week to assess the property." I guided my mother out of the conference room and down the quiet hallway. The air inside the elevator was stifling. We rode down to the lobby in silence, the hum of the machinery masking the sound of our shattered lives. When we stepped out into the biting cold of the parking lot, the wind immediately whipped my hair across my face. I opened the door of my beat-up truck and helped my mother inside. She huddled against the passenger door, pulling her coat tightly around her shoulders. I climbed into the driver's seat, but I did not start the engine immediately. I watched Connor emerge from the glass doors of the building. He did not look our way. He pulled out his phone, dialing a number, as he walked briskly toward his heated luxury SUV. He looked relieved. He looked like a man who had just survived a shipwreck by standing on someone else's shoulders. I pulled the compass out of my pocket and unwrapped it again. The needle was still jammed. I held it up to the dim winter light, examining the casing. That was when I saw the tiny numbers etched into the brass right beneath the bezel. It was not a serial number. It was a frequency code. My father had not left me a broken toy. He had left me a map, and I was going to follow it, no matter where it led. The cold fury building in my chest was absolute. Valerie thought she had claimed the empire. Connor thought he had secured his future. But they had just declared war on a woman who knew how to survive the freeze. The 30-day transition period mentioned in the will was nothing but a legal fiction designed to make the paperwork look civilized. Valerie wanted us out immediately. By the time I drove my mother back from the downtown law office to the sprawling mountain estate, a commercial moving truck was already idling in the circular driveway. The heavy diesel exhaust plumed into the freezing air like thick gray smoke, warning of a fire inside. Men in heavy insulated coveralls were marching through the front doors, hauling my mother's entire life out into the snow. My mother walked through the grand foyer like a sleepwalker. Cardboard boxes were piled high against the custom cedar walls she had helped design. The moving crew tapped their watches, impatient with our presence. Valerie had hired them to pack up our bare personal essentials and leave the expensive furniture, the artwork, and the legacy for her own interior decorators. I watched my mother wrap a single framed photograph of my father in a discarded newspaper. Her hands shook uncontrollably, but she did not shed a single tear. The pure shock of the morning had frozen her tear ducts solid. She was a hollow shell of the vibrant woman who had hosted corporate galas in this very room. I could not stand there and watch her drown. I left her packing her winter sweaters and drove my truck straight to Connor's house. He lived in an exclusive gated community overlooking the inlet. It was a neighborhood where driveways were perpetually heated, and the harsh reality of the Alaskan winter was kept safely behind triple-pane glass. I pounded my fist against his mahogany front door until his wife Jessica finally opened it. She wore a plush cashmere sweater and a deep frown, holding a tiny, shivering dog against her chest. She stepped aside without a word, letting me pass into the pristine foyer. I found Connor hiding in his home office. The room smelled of fresh cedar and expensive imported leather. He stood by the tall window looking out at the frozen water below. In his right hand, he held a heavy crystal tumbler filled with a $200 scotch. He took a slow, deliberate sip. His left hand nervously adjusted the knot of his silk tie. He refused to turn around when I entered the room. I demanded he take action. I reminded him that he was still the vice president of operations. He held the corporate leverage to freeze the transition period. He had the financial resources to hire a team of ruthless litigators to contest the new will and protect the woman who raised us. I pleaded with him to fight for our mother, to use his executive power to push back against the Seattle invaders. He finally turned to face me, but his eyes remained firmly fixed on the polished floorboards. He took another sip of his scotch. The ice clinked against the crystal edge, creating a hollow, pathetic sound in the quiet room. "Alida," he said, his voice sounding flat and rehearsed, "you need to calm down and look at this rationally. The paperwork is ironclad. If I make a scene, Valerie will strip my stock options and terminate my contract. I have a mortgage. I have a certain lifestyle to maintain. I cannot throw myself on a grenade just because you are feeling sentimental. Business is business. You need to stop being so emotional and figure out your own next steps." I stared at the golden child of the Bush family. Growing up, he was the one destined for the executive boardroom, while I was relegated to the drafty maintenance hangars. My father had paid for his Ivy League business education, while I learned cargo logistics by tracking supply planes through whiteout blizzards. Connor was supposed to be the protector of this family. Instead, he was a coward, hiding behind a crystal glass. I left his house without saying another word. But as I drove back to the mountain estate, a cold realization settled deep into my bones. Connor was selfish, yes. He was also a creature of comfort who hated taking risks. For him to accept this hostile takeover so easily, without even a token protest, meant something else was at play. He was too calm during the reading. The math simply did not add up. When I returned to the estate, the movers were taking their lunch break in the cab of their truck. My mother was sitting on a taped box, staring blankly at the stone fireplace. I walked past her and went directly into my father's old study. I booted up my rugged operational terminal. My job title was Wilderness Logistics Coordinator. Valerie and her arrogant children thought that merely meant I loaded heavy crates onto cargo planes. They did not understand what modern logistics actually required in a landscape as unforgiving as Alaska. I was the central nervous system of the entire fleet. I tracked volatile weather patterns, monitored fuel consumptions, and managed communications across a secure, encrypted corporate network. I held the highest level of administrative digital clearance in the company because if a plane went down in the Brooks Range, I needed to bypass every firewall to find our pilots. I did not search the general corporate servers. I bypassed the standard security protocols and tunneled directly into Connor's executive laptop. He always used the same weak passwords. It was a careless habit born from a lifelong sense of entitlement. I pulled up his archived emails, searching for any correspondence with Valerie or her Seattle lawyer. At first, the inbox showed nothing unusual. But then I checked the deleted folders and the hidden subdirectories. He had tried to scrub his digital tracks, but data footprints are notoriously stubborn if you know exactly where to dig. I found a hidden, encrypted chain of messages. I ran a sophisticated decryption key I normally used for securing sensitive flight manifests. The text unspooled across my glowing screen. I read the first email. It was dated 6 months before my father suffered his fatal heart attack. The sender was Connor. The recipient was Valerie. My blood ran cold as the Arctic wind howling outside the study window. Connor was not a sudden victim of this ambush. He was the architect. The emails detailed a meticulous and calculated treason. 6 months ago, Valerie had approached him with the secret 1993 divorce decree and the threat of exposing the hidden marriage. Instead of warning our father or protecting our mother, Connor saw a golden opportunity. My father had recently been grooming a new executive team, and Connor was terrified he was going to be passed over for the chief executive position. Connor made a deal with the devil. He provided Valerie with the internal corporate leverage she desperately needed to spring the trap. He sent her the confidential asset lists, the private flight schedules, and the names of the board members who could be easily bought or intimidated. He even provided her the contact information for the aggressive Seattle lawyer who specialized in hostile estate takeovers. In exchange, Valerie made a written contractual promise. Once Richard was gone and the new will was executed, she would clear out the old guard and officially name Connor the Chief Executive Officer of Bush Freight and Aviation. He had sold our father out. He had thrown our mother to the wolves. He had traded 3 decades of shared family history for a corner office and a title upgrade. The betrayal was premeditated, clinical, and breathtaking in its cruelty. He was not sipping that expensive scotch because he was nervous about the unpredictable future. He was quietly celebrating his incoming promotion. I printed the damning emails, folding the hard copies and sliding them into my heavy coat pocket, right next to the rusted brass compass. Knowledge was power, but only if deployed at the exact right moment. If I confronted him now, Valerie would simply accelerate her timeline and lock us out of the corporate network entirely. I needed to wait. I needed to let the usurpers become comfortable in their stolen kingdom. The movers finally finished loading the few meager boxes Valerie deemed we were allowed to keep. The sun began to dip below the jagged peaks of the Chugach Mountains, casting long, dark shadows across the pristine snow. The temperature plummeted another 10 degrees in a matter of minutes. I helped my mother into the passenger seat of my rugged truck. We had nowhere to go in the city. The family bank accounts were frozen pending probate, and the modest relocation stipend Harrison mentioned would not arrive for weeks. We were officially exiled from our own lives. I drove us out of Anchorage, heading deep into the Matanuska Valley. I owned a tiny off-grid cabin near a frozen lake. I bought it years ago with my own savings, intending it to be a quiet place to escape the corporate noise of my demanding family. Now it was our only sanctuary. The drive was treacherous. The roads were slick with black ice, and the wind battered against the windshield. Inside the cab, the heater struggled to keep the creeping frost at bay. My mother stared out the window at the endless expanse of blinding white. She had entered that sprawling mountain estate as a vibrant, confident wife. She was leaving it as a destitute stranger, stripped of her identity and her home. We arrived at the cabin long after dark. The structure was small, built from raw timber, with a heavy tin roof that groaned under the weight of the accumulated snow. There was no cellular service out here, no heated driveways or luxury amenities, just an iron wood-burning stove and the biting isolation of the deep Alaskan wilderness. I unlocked the heavy wooden door and guided my mother inside. The air in the cabin was colder than the air outside, trapping the bitter chill within its wooden walls. I sat her down on a dusty sofa, wrapping her in every heavy wool blanket I could find. Her teeth chattered, creating a sharp, rhythmic sound in the dark room. I immediately went to work. I chopped kindling in the dim light of a battery-powered lantern. I fed the dry logs into the stove, striking a match and coaxing the small flames to life. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls. Slowly, the bitter cold began to retreat from the center of the room. I crouched by the open stove, watching the fire burn while feeling the heat seep into my numb fingers. My brother had orchestrated our ruin for a fancy title. My father's secret double life had destroyed my mother. The new dynasty thought they had successfully banished me to the ice, expecting me to freeze and fade away quietly into the night. They forgot one crucial detail about the daughter they overlooked. I thrived in the cold. I knew how to navigate the brutal storms they spent their entire privileged lives hiding from. I reached into my coat pocket and pulled out the rusted brass compass. I ran my thumb over the engraved frequency code shining in the firelight. Connor and Valerie had drawn their battle lines in the snow. Now it was my turn to find out exactly what kind of weapon my father had left me to fight back. The iron stove radiated a steady, dry heat against my face as I fed another split log into the flames. Outside the cabin walls, the Alaskan wind shrieked like a wounded animal battering the tin roof. I adjusted the thick wool blankets around my sleeping mother. Her breathing was shallow, but steady. The shock had exhausted her body, pulling her into a deep, restorative sleep. She was safe for now, protected by the raw timber and the roaring fire. I retreated to the small wooden table in the corner of the room, pulling the lantern closer. I placed the tarnished brass compass on the scratched surface. The glass cover caught the flickering light. I tapped the casing. The needle did not waver. I rotated the instrument 90 degrees. The needle remained locked, pointing stubbornly toward the heavy timber wall instead of magnetic north. My father did not make mistakes when it came to navigation. He built Bush freight and aviation by mapping trade routes through the most treacherous skies on the continent. If he gave me a compass with a stuck needle, the malfunction was the message. I picked up a magnifying glass I kept for reading topographical maps and examined the tiny numbers etched beneath the bezel. They were not serial digits. They matched a specific, localized radio frequency. The needle was permanently magnetized to track a distinct homing beacon broadcasting on a shortwave band. I knew exactly where that beacon was hidden. Years ago, long before Connor traded his rugged boots for Italian leather, my father used to take me tracking deep into the Matanuska Valley. We hunted caribou, avoiding the tourist trails and venturing into the forgotten scars of the landscape. He taught me how to read the ice, how to respect the sudden drops in barometric pressure, and how to survive when the environment actively tried to kill you. During one of those trips, we stumbled upon a relic from the past. I stood up, pulling my heavy thermal parka off the wooden peg near the door. I laced my insulated boots tight, securing the grips. I strapped a hunting knife to my belt and slung my rifle over my shoulder. The wilderness did not care about corporate betrayal or secret divorce decrees. Out here, the cold was the only judge, and it ruled without mercy. I wrote a brief note telling my mother I had gone to check the perimeter and placed it next to a thermos of hot tea. I pushed the heavy front door open. The blizzard hit me like a physical blow. The snow was blowing sideways, reducing visibility to a few arm lengths. I climbed into my battered truck and forced the engine to turn over. The headlights cut a weak yellow path through the blinding whiteout. I drove to the edge of the wilderness grid, pushing the old transmission until the unplowed snowdrifts became impassable. I killed the engine. From here, I had to rely on my own legs. I strapped on my snowshoes and stepped out into the howling void. The temperature had plunged to 30 below zero. The air burned my lungs with every breath, and the ice crystals stung my exposed cheeks like shattered glass. I held the compass flat in my heavy gloved hand. The needle pulled straight ahead, leading me away from the safety of the road and directly into the treacherous frozen valley. Each step was a battle against the elements. The wind pushed against my chest, trying to knock me off balance. Snowdrifts disguised deep, treacherous crevices. I used my rifle stock to test the ground before committing my weight. Connor and Valerie were currently sitting in heated Anchorage luxury, plotting their corporate takeover, while I was fighting frostbite in the middle of a killer storm. My father knew this. He knew my brother would fold at the first sign of friction. He knew Valerie would refuse to step foot outside the city limits. He designed this final trial exclusively for the daughter who learned to conquer the freeze. 2 hours into the trek, the terrain began to rise. My muscles burned. My eyelashes were heavy with ice. The needle on the compass began to quiver, indicating I was close to the broadcast source. I crested a steep ridge leaning against the wind. Below me, half buried in a permanent snowbank, sat a concrete structure. It was an abandoned World War II-era aviation bunker. The military had built hundreds of them across the Alaskan territory decades ago to monitor the skies, and eventually left them to rot in the permafrost. I slid down the icy embankment toward the rusted steel door. The entrance was blocked by a thick layer of frozen snow. I used my boots and the butt of my rifle to chip away the ice. My breath plumed in the freezing air as I finally grabbed the heavy iron handle. It screamed in protest, but gave way, sliding open just enough for me to squeeze inside. The interior was pitch black and smelled of ancient dust and damp concrete. I clicked on my tactical flashlight. The beam swept across the empty, cavernous space. Rusted metal shelves lined the walls. Decaying wooden crates sat stacked in the corners. The wind outside sounded muffled, a distant roar reduced to a steady hum behind the thick concrete walls. I followed the compass needle. It pointed directly toward the center of the room. I walked over the uneven concrete floor, scanning the ground. Near a crumbling support pillar, I noticed a single wooden floorboard that looked slightly less weathered than the rest. I knelt down, wedging the blade of my hunting knife into the seam. I pried the board upward. Beneath the false floor sat a reinforced, waterproof lockbox. A small battery-powered radio transmitter was attached to the side, pulsing a silent homing beacon on the exact frequency etched into my brass compass. I pulled the box from its hiding spot. My fingers were numb as I retrieved the small key taped to the back of the compass. I inserted it into the lock and turned. The latch clicked open. Inside lay a pristine manila envelope. No dust, no moisture. It had been waiting for me. I opened the flap and pulled out a stack of documents, holding them under the bright beam of my flashlight. The first item was a handwritten letter on my father's personal stationery. Alida, he wrote. His penmanship was sharp and familiar. If you are reading this in the bunker, it means my heart finally gave out and the wolves have arrived at the door. I am sorry I could not warn you or your mother in person. My medical prognosis gave me very little time, and I was being watched closely. I read the words, feeling a tight knot form in my throat. He knew he was dying. 6 months ago, Valerie cornered me, the letter continued. She found the Nevada decree and demanded control of the company. I realized Connor was feeding her internal documents, helping her orchestrate a hostile transition. Your brother traded his loyalty for an unearned promotion. I could not fight them in open court. A public scandal would have frozen our corporate assets and destroyed the supply lines half the state relies on to survive the winter. So I chose to surrender the shell and protect the core. I turned the page, my flashlight beam shaking slightly. The will Valerie holds is legally binding, he wrote. She owns Bush Freight and Aviation, but she does not own the planes. She does not own the land. She does not own the fuel reserves. I built a fortress she cannot breach. Attached to this letter are the access codes to a private wealth management firm in Zurich. Contact them immediately. They are waiting for your signal. You are the only one I trust to hold the line. Alida, let them think they won. Then remind them who actually controls the ice. I set the letter down and pulled out the second document. It was a heavy piece of encrypted parchment paper bearing the seal of a Swiss banking institution. Below the crest was a direct international phone number and a complex alphanumeric passcode. I stared at the numbers. My father had not left us destitute. He had anticipated the betrayal, mapped the enemy's movements, and hidden the true wealth behind a fortress of operational secrecy. Valerie had inherited a company that only looked like an empire on paper. I packed the documents into my internal coat pocket and secured the lockbox. I needed to get back to the cabin. I needed to establish a satellite connection to Switzerland. The cold deep inside my bones was entirely gone, replaced by a blazing, relentless heat. The secret family thought they had exiled me to the wasteland. They did not realize my father had just handed me the keys to a hidden kingdom. I zipped my parka, stepped back out into the raging blizzard, and began the long march home, ready to make that international call and flip the board on all of them. The hike back from the frozen bunker tested every limit of my physical endurance. My muscles burned with exhaustion, and frost clung to my eyelashes, blurring my vision. Yet the adrenaline pumping through my veins kept me moving forward, pushing through the deep snowdrifts. I carried the pristine manila envelope tucked close to my chest, protecting it from the raging blizzard. When I finally reached the cabin, the heavy timber door groaned loudly as I shoved it open against the harsh wind. Inside the small structure, the fire had burned down to a pile of glowing embers. The temperature had dropped, but it was still a sanctuary compared to the lethal chill outside. My mother remained asleep on the dusty sofa. Her breathing was steady, undisturbed by my return. I walked over to the iron stove and fed another log into the flames, watching the sparks dance upward. I did not bother taking off my heavy snow boots. The thick rubber soles left small puddles of melting ice on the wooden floorboards. I unzipped my parka and retrieved the documents, setting them on the small table. Then I pulled my encrypted satellite terminal from my operational duffel bag. My position as a wilderness coordinator required me to establish secure communications from the most isolated coordinates on the map. I flipped open the rugged casing and powered the unit on. The screen cast a pale blue glow across the dark room. I positioned the portable dish near the frosted window, angling it toward the southern sky to catch a passing satellite. The signal strength indicator flickered before locking into place. I opened a secure encrypted video conferencing channel and typed the complex alphanumeric passcode my father had left in the lockbox. I pressed the call button. The system routed the connection across the globe. After 3 rings, the screen shifted from a loading prompt to a crystal-clear video feed. I found myself looking into a hyper-modern executive office. Floor-to-ceiling windows displayed the pristine, snow-capped peaks of the Swiss Alps, bathed in morning sunlight. The contrast was staggering. I was sitting in a drafty, off-grid timber cabin, wearing a damp thermal jacket and insulated boots. The man on the screen sat behind a sleek glass desk, wearing a bespoke navy suit that probably cost more than my truck. He looked at his monitor and offered a polite, deferential nod. "Good morning, Miss Bush," he said. His accent was precise and cultured. "My name is Klaus. I am the senior wealth manager representing your late father's international legal team. We have been waiting for your signal." I pulled a chair out and sat down. "I found the lockbox, Klaus." I read the letter. "He told me to contact you immediately." Klaus adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses. "Richard was a brilliant strategist. We mourn his passing, but we are prepared to execute his final directives. I assume you are calling to inquire about the true nature of your inheritance." "I need to understand what Valerie actually controls," I said. "I need to know the scope of the battlefield." Klaus tapped a few keys on his polished keyboard. A series of digital files appeared on my screen. "I will explain the architecture of the trap your father built," he began. 5 years ago, Richard foresaw potential instability within his corporate structure. He engaged our firm to separate his tangible assets from his operational liabilities. He brought up a complex organizational chart. He created a private blind trust registered in Zurich under the name the Compass Group. Over the course of 3 years, he quietly transferred the property titles of every physical asset associated with the business into this trust. I leaned closer to the screen, tracing the diagrams. "Every physical asset?" I asked. "Every single one," Klaus confirmed. "The entire fleet of cargo planes, the heavy-lifting helicopters, the Anchorage shipping yards, the Fairbanks logistics hubs, even the strategic aviation fuel reserves tucked away in the remote tundra outposts. The Compass Group owns all of it." I sat back in my wooden chair, letting the magnitude of his words sink in. "Then what exactly is Bush Freight and Aviation? What did the new will give to Valerie and my brother?" Klaus offered a thin, knowing smile. "Valerie inherited a phantom empire. Bush Freight and Aviation is now merely an operating shell. It holds the brand name, the customer contracts, and the employee payroll. But the company owns zero hardware. In order to fulfill those lucrative shipping contracts, Valerie must lease the planes, the hangars, and the equipment directly from the Compass Group. My mind raced assembling the puzzle pieces. She has to pay monthly usage fees to the trust, I realized. Precisely, Klaus said. And the lease agreements are ironclad. They require the operating company to adhere to strict maintenance schedules and safety protocols. If Valerie or Connor default on those payments or violate the operational safety terms, the Compass Group has the legal right to instantly terminate the leases and repossess the entire fleet. My father had orchestrated a masterpiece of corporate warfare. He knew Valerie was blinded by greed. He knew Connor only cared about his fancy title and his corner office. They saw a $50 million valuation on paper and assumed they had won the lottery. They never bothered to check who actually held the deeds to the vehicles. They were sitting in the cockpit of an airplane they did not own. But Richard did not stop there. Klaus continued bringing up a secondary financial ledger. When the extortion plot began several months ago, he instructed us to amend the foundational documents of the Compass Group. He removed himself as the primary entity and named you the sole, irrevocable beneficiary. I stared at the numbers scrolling across my secure terminal. The columns were dizzying. I expected to see the value of the aviation equipment. I did not expect to see the vast, diversified portfolio accompanying it. The trust holds extensive international investments, Klaus explained, real estate in London and Tokyo, tech sector venture capital funds, secure municipal bonds. The liquid assets alone total over $400 million. Combined with the valuation of the Alaskan logistics hardware, your current net worth exceeds $500 million. The air in the cabin suddenly felt thin. I gripped the edges of the wooden table. Less than 24 hours ago, I was standing in a downtown law office being mocked by a woman who handed me a rusted compass. My own brother had told me to figure out my next steps while he secured his comfortable executive lifestyle. They thought they had banished me to the freezing wilderness with nothing but the clothes on my back. Instead, I was the central authority. I was the landlord of their entire existence. Miss Bush, Klaus asked, gently breaking the silence. As the sole director of the Compass Group, you have immediate options. We can enforce a hostile audit on Bush Freight right now. We can notify Valerie that her leases are under review. We can squeeze their operational budget and evict them from the corporate headquarters by Friday. Give the word and my legal team will ground the fleet before the sun sets in Anchorage. I looked away from the glowing screen and stared out the frosted window. The blizzard was still raging outside, tearing through the valley. The wind battered the sturdy timber walls of the cabin, trying to find a weakness. My father knew this environment better than anyone. He knew that survival in the North did not come from shouting or making sudden, aggressive movements. Survival came from patience. It came from watching your opponent make a fatal mistake in the snow. Connor and Valerie were arrogant. They had already started making changes. I knew their first instinct would be to maximize their new profits by slashing the operational budgets. They would cut the specialized winter maintenance programs because they did not understand the brutal reality of the Alaskan climate. They thought running a freight business was just a matter of signing papers in a heated boardroom. They did not know the planes belonged to me. They did not know they were legally bound to maintain them perfectly. I turned back to the screen. Klaus sat patiently, waiting for my command. "No," I said. My voice was calm and steady. "Do not send any notices. Do not initiate an audit. We will remain entirely invisible." Klaus raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "You wish to let them continue operating the shell company?" "I want to let them think they won," I explained. "They are currently celebrating their brilliant hostile takeover. They believe they outsmarted my father and discarded me. If we strike now, they will just declare bankruptcy and walk away with whatever cash they can scramble together. That is not a punishment. That is an escape hatch." I leaned closer to the camera, ensuring Klaus understood my directive perfectly. "I want to watch them try to run a logistics network in the middle of an Arctic winter. I want them to make reckless decisions. Let them slash the maintenance budgets. Let them violate the safety terms of my lease agreements. I will not ground the fleet. Klaus. I'm going to let them try to fly those planes in a blizzard. And when their engines freeze and their contracts fail, I will be the one holding the legal trap that destroys them permanently. Klaus offered a respectful bow of his head. Understood, Miss Bush. We will monitor their corporate filings and await your next instruction. I severed the connection and closed the satellite terminal. The cabin was quiet again, save for the crackling fire. I looked at the rusted brass compass resting on the table. It had guided me through the storm and delivered an empire into my hands. The secret family thought they had stolen a crown. They had no idea they had just inherited a ticking time bomb. All I had to do now was sit in the warmth of my hidden sanctuary and wait for the detonation. I spent my days inside the drafty timber cabin tracking high-pressure weather systems, while the new owners settled into my father's Anchorage headquarters. The executive suite occupied the top floor, overlooking the frozen inlet. Valerie wasted no time erasing our family history. She replaced the functional aviation charts with expensive modern art and ordered custom ergonomic furniture. Trenton appointed himself the director of field operations. I knew this because I monitored his social media accounts from my encrypted terminal. He posted photos standing on the pristine corporate balcony wearing a bright white designer parka. The jacket had never touched real snow. His caption read, "Conquering the last frontier, one supply chain at a time." He held a ceramic mug of artisanal coffee, looking out at the mountains like he owned them. He did not realize the cold weather gear he wore would freeze solid if he actually stepped onto a real tarmac. He was playing a rugged character in a carefully curated digital play, while the real world waited to break him. They needed fast cash to fund their new, lavish lifestyle. A freight operation requires immense liquid capital just to keep the engines running during an Arctic winter. De-icing fluid, specialized thermal oil, reinforced landing gear components, and heated hangar spaces. These are not optional expenses. They are the fragile difference between a successful delivery and a fatal crash in the tundra. Valerie looked at the accounting ledgers and saw only wasted profit margins. She did not understand the physics of ice. She ordered immediate budget reductions across every mechanical department. Connor knew better. He had worked in logistics long enough to understand the lethal risks of cutting corners during a hard freeze. But Valerie held his promised chief executive title over his head like a dangling carrot. He craved that corner office and the prestige that came with it. He signed off on the catastrophic reductions without a single protest. He canceled the standing orders for premium aviation antifreeze. He mandated that the cargo planes be stored outside on the freezing tarmac to save on hangar heating costs. He replaced the veteran maintenance crews with cheap, inexperienced contractors imported from the lower 48 states, men who had never seen an engine block crack from extreme sub-zero temperatures. Meanwhile, Brianna took full control of the corporate accounts. She treated the operational credit lines like her own personal piggy bank. My surveillance network flagged unauthorized transactions every single day. $5,000 for a private dinner in downtown Seattle. $10,000 for a weekend retreat at a luxury ski resort. She bought designer handbags and chartered private flights using the funds designated for emergency aircraft repairs. They were bleeding the shell company dry, unaware that every dollar they stole brought them closer to defaulting on my lease agreements. I sat in the dim light of my cabin, watching their digital footprint unfold across my screen. The pale blue glow illuminated the dark wooden walls. I compiled a meticulous dossier of every single infraction. When Connor canceled the thermal engine inspections, he violated Section 4 of the asset lease. When Valerie fired the union-certified mechanics, she breached the fundamental safety clauses required to operate my helicopters. They were driving leased vehicles straight toward a cliff, and I was simply recording their license plates. My mother rested on the sofa nearby, slowly regaining her strength, while I built a legal cage around our enemies. The veteran employees did not take the sudden terminations quietly. Men and women who had flown for my father for 2 decades were suddenly handed cardboard boxes and escorted off the property by private security guards. These were pilots who could land a heavy cargo plane on a narrow glacier blindfolded. Mechanics who could rebuild an engine in blinding winds. They were the true lifeblood of the Alaskan supply chain, and Valerie treated them like disposable trash. I did not let them wander into the harsh job market. I waited until the dust settled, and then I visited them personally. I drove my battered truck to a dimly lit tavern on the outskirts of the city where the old guard gathered to drink cheap beer and share their grievances. The air inside smelled of stale hops and wet wool. When I walked through the heavy wooden door, conversations stopped. They looked at me with a mixture of pity and resentment, assuming I was just another casualty of the Seattle takeover. I walked past the crowded bar and sat down at a corner booth with Marcus. He was our chief pilot, a grizzled man with deep lines etched into his face from years of squinting into the sun glare bouncing off the ice. He had taught me how to read barometric pressure drops when I was 12 years old. He was fiercely loyal to my father, and seeing him unemployed felt like a crime against the territory itself. He took a slow sip of his drink and shook his head. "Your father would be sick if he saw what those people were doing to his fleet, Alida. They are going to get someone killed." I slid a thick manila folder across the sticky wooden table. I did not raise my voice. I leaned in close so only he could hear. I told him Bush Freight and Aviation was a dead entity. I explained that Valerie only owned the paperwork, but I held the deeds to the actual hardware. I opened the folder to reveal a pristine employment contract, drafted by my Swiss attorneys. "The Compass Group is hiring," I told him. "The pay is double your previous salary, and the benefits are guaranteed by an international trust." Marcus stared at the numbers on the page. His weathered hands trembled slightly as the reality of the situation dawned on him. "You are building a shadow company," he whispered. "No," I corrected him. "I am keeping the real company intact while the parasites starve themselves out." I told him to gather the best pilots and the most skilled mechanics. I put them all on my payroll that very night. Their instructions were simple. Stay home. Rest. Keep your cold weather gear ready. When the inevitable crisis hits and the new regime fails, the state will need operators who actually know how to fly. We were going to be the invisible safety net, ready to catch the falling sky. The tension was thick enough to cut with a hunting knife. Every day, the temperature dropped a little lower. Every night, the frost crept a little higher up the windows of my cabin. Valerie and Trenton were drinking champagne in first class, oblivious to the fact that they had fired the only people who knew how to steer the ship. They were heading straight for a jagged mountain peak, and I had secretly packed all the parachutes. But greed is a restless disease. It is never satisfied with simply taking the lion's share. It always comes back for the scraps. Valerie was not content with stealing a $50 million logistics empire. She wanted to erase our existence entirely. She started digging through the old financial records, searching for loose ends. She found the original mortgage documents for the tiny off-grid cabin where my mother and I were currently hiding. She saw an opportunity to twist the knife one final time. She was about to send a process server to our front door, aiming to throw us out into the snow. She thought she was kicking a stray dog. She did not realize she was walking directly into a bear trap. The quiet rhythm of our off-grid existence was a fragile comfort. Every morning I woke up before dawn to split firewood and check the perimeter of our isolated sanctuary. My mother was slowly finding her footing again. She started helping with small tasks, like brewing chicory coffee on the iron stove and mending torn thermal socks. The brutal shock of my father's secret life was fading into a dull, manageable ache. We were surviving the Matanuska Valley winter on our own terms. But greed is a restless disease. It cannot simply enjoy the spoils of war. It must hunt down every last scrap of resistance and burn it to ash. Valerie had secured a $50 million logistics empire. She lived in a sprawling mountain estate surrounded by expensive art and heated floors. Yet she could not tolerate the idea that my mother and I still possessed a tiny, drafty timber cabin in the wilderness. She wanted us erased from the map. Her opportunity arrived hidden inside decades-old financial records. Long before bush freight became a titan of industry, my father took out a modest line of credit to purchase early cargo planes. He had used this very cabin as collateral for that ancient corporate loan. The debt had been refinanced and bundled a dozen times over the years, but the lien on the property technically remained on the books. Valerie instructed her lawyers to weaponize that forgotten clause. The attack came on a Tuesday morning. The temperature hovered near 10 degrees below zero. I was on the porch, stacking freshly chopped spruce logs, when a sleek black sedan crawled up our unplowed driveway. The vehicle struggled against the deep snow ruts, the tires spinning uselessly, before finally coming to a halt near the tree line. A man stepped out of the driver's seat. He wore a thin wool peacoat and polished dress shoes. He was a city dweller, a process server, hired by the new Seattle regime to do their dirty work. He clutched a thick manila envelope under his arm and marched toward our cabin with unearned confidence. He did not understand the physics of Alaskan black ice. He stepped onto the wooden stairs of our porch without testing his footing. His polished leather shoes found zero traction. His legs flew out from under him, and he hit the frozen timber with a sickening thud. The manila envelope sailed through the icy air, scattering legal documents across the snow. I did not offer him a hand. I stood by the woodpile holding my steel splitting axe and watched him groan in pain. He scrambled to his knees, clutching his bruised elbow and frantically gathering the scattered papers. He shoved the crumpled stack toward my boots, his breath pluming in the freezing air. "Notice of foreclosure," he stammered, shivering uncontrollably in his thin coat. "You and Susan Bush have 48 hours to vacate the premises. The property is being seized by the holding company." He did not wait for a response. He scrambled back to his sedan, threw it into reverse, and fishtailed down the driveway until he disappeared into the whiteout. I picked up the papers. The legal jargon was dense, but the intent was crystal clear. Valerie was calling in the old lien. She planned to send local sheriffs to drag us out into the snow by Thursday. Before I could even carry the documents inside, my satellite phone buzzed in my coat pocket. The caller ID displayed Connor's encrypted number. I answered the call, letting the freezing wind howl into the receiver. Alida. His voice sounded tight and nervous. "Listen to me. I just saw the legal filings cross my desk. Valerie is foreclosing on the cabin. I know Connor. The process server just left. He bruised his ego on my porch. You need to pack up, Mom, and leave right now," he urged. "Do not fight this. I can wire you a few $100s. There is a cheap roadside motel near the highway junction. Just go stay there until this blows over. Please do not rock the boat. I am days away from finalizing my chief executive contract, and I cannot afford any family drama ruining my transition." I closed my eyes, letting the raw chill of the wind center my focus. My own brother, the man who grew up sharing a dinner table with the woman currently sleeping inside that cabin, was asking me to drag our mother to a dilapidated highway motel. He wanted me to surrender our last safe haven just so he could secure his fancy title and his corner office. "Connor," I said, my voice dropping to a low, deadly whisper, "do not ever call this number again." I disconnected the line and turned the phone off. There would be no more retreating. I had played the silent observer long enough. Valerie wanted to use corporate debt to destroy my family. It was time to show her what real financial leverage looked like. I walked into the cabin, brushing the snow off my boots. My mother looked up from the stove, sensing the shift in my demeanor. I offered her a reassuring smile, told her everything was fine, and retreated to my corner desk. I opened the rugged casing of my satellite terminal and powered up the encrypted uplink. I angled the portable dish toward the window, waiting for the signal bars to lock into place. I initiated a secure video conference. Klaus answered on the second ring. He sat in his pristine Zurich office looking sharp and alert. "Good evening, Miss Bush. How can the Compass Group serve you today?" "Valerie is trying to foreclose on my cabin," I explained, getting straight to the point. "She found an ancient lien tied to a corporate line of credit. She wants us freezing in the street by Thursday." Klaus narrowed his eyes, his professional demeanor shifting into a predatory focus. "That is an unacceptable overreach. How would you like to proceed?" "I want to buy the lease she is holding," I commanded. Bush Freight and Aviation currently carries millions in operational debt. The new regime is funding their lavish lifestyle and their poor management decisions on borrowed money. I want the Compass Group to purchase every single outstanding loan, every credit line, and every financial obligation tied to that shell company. I want to own their debt, Klaus. All of it. Klaus typed rapidly across his keyboard, his eyes scanning multiple monitors. The target company owes approximately $15 million to various regional banks and private lenders. They are highly leveraged. Given the immense liquid capital within your trust, we can acquire these portfolios through anonymous European subsidiaries within 2 hours. We can buy the debt for pennies on the dollar, since the regional banks are already nervous about the recent change in leadership. "Do it," I ordered. "And the second you own that paper, I want you to send Valerie a message." I detailed the exact terms of the legal strike. I did not want to crush them today. I wanted to paralyze them with fear. 2 hours later, the financial trap slammed shut. I sat watching my screen as Klaus forwarded me the confirmation receipts. The Compass Group, operating through a web of untraceable overseas holdings, had successfully purchased the entirety of Bush Freight operational debt. We were now their sole creditor. In downtown Anchorage, Valerie was sitting in her heated executive suite, reviewing fabric swatches for her new office furniture. Her pristine fax machine hummed to life, printing a single page marked with urgent international priority. I knew exactly what that document said because I dictated every word. The notice informed the new corporate officers that an anonymous European conglomerate had assumed all of their financial liabilities. It outlined a terrifying and ironclad ultimatum. If Bush Freight and Aviation proceeded with the foreclosure of the Matanuska Valley cabin, or if they ever harassed Susan Bush again, the European holding company would instantly call in the $15 million loan. The entire sum would be due, payable in full, within 24 hours. Failure to pay would result in the immediate seizure of all corporate assets and the personal bankruptcy of every executive officer. It was a financial guillotine suspended by a single thread directly over her head. My surveillance software monitored the internal communications of the shell company. Less than 10 minutes after the fax was delivered, chaos erupted in the executive suite. Valerie frantically called her Seattle lawyers, demanding to know who this mysterious conglomerate was and how they had acquired such devastating leverage. The lawyers had no answers. They could only confirm that the threat was legally binding and undeniably lethal. Valerie was trapped. She had spent the last month playing Queen of the Ice, unaware that a hidden dragon was sleeping beneath the throne. She immediately ordered her legal team to withdraw the foreclosure notice. She canceled the sheriffs. She backed away from our cabin like a person who had just stepped on a live landmine. I closed my satellite terminal and leaned back in my wooden chair. The silence in the cabin was triumphant. My mother was safe. Our sanctuary remained untouchable. Valerie now understood that she was not operating in a vacuum. She knew an invisible predator was circling her fragile empire. But financial fear was only the beginning. Valerie and Connor had gut the maintenance budgets and fired the veteran pilots. They had stripped the defenses of the logistics network, leaving the cargo fleet highly vulnerable. They had focused all their attention on luxury expenditures and petty vengeance. They failed to look at the sky. Outside my window, the wind suddenly changed direction. The barometric pressure began a steep, historic plunge. The true test was no longer about legal documents or corporate debt. The deepest, darkest part of the Alaskan winter was finally arriving, and it was going to freeze their stolen kingdom solid. The Matanuska Valley grew quiet as the pressure system collapsed. The birds vanished, the small game dug deep into the permafrost, and the sky turned a bruised, heavy gray. It was mid-January, and the weather patterns I monitored on my satellite feed indicated a storm of historic proportions. Meteorologists called it a 100-year blizzard. A swirling vortex of sub-zero air and blinding snow was descending upon the Alaskan territory, ready to swallow everything in its path. This was the crucible. My father had built his entire logistics empire around moments exactly like this. When the commercial airlines grounded their commercial flights and the state highways became impassable, Bush Freight and Aviation was supposed to be the lifeline. Remote communities relied on our cargo deliveries for emergency medical supplies, heating fuel, and essential food rations. The contracts were lucrative, but they came with severe, uncompromising penalties for failure. Inside the heated Anchorage executive suite, Valerie and her children were oblivious to the approaching devastation. Trenton was busy organizing a corporate ski trip for his new Seattle friends, while Brianna finalized the interior design of her corner office. Connor, the supposed operations expert, ignored the flashing red warnings on the dispatch terminal. He assumed the new, cheap contract mechanics had properly winterized the fleet. He was wrong. The storm hit with terrifying speed. Wind gusts reached 80 miles per hour, tearing the roof panels off commercial buildings and burying the tarmac under 3 feet of solid ice. The state governor declared a state of emergency. The distress calls from the remote northern outposts started flooding the corporate switchboard. A clinic in Nome needed critical antibiotics. A village near Barrow was dangerously low on diesel generators. Valerie, sitting in her expensive ergonomic chair, finally realized the gravity of the situation. The state contracts were no longer just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were legal obligations tied to human survival. She ordered Trenton to deploy the fleet immediately. Trenton picked up his phone and commanded the newly hired contract pilots to take off. The pilots braved the whiteout conditions and climbed into the cockpits of the heavy cargo planes sitting exposed on the freezing tarmac. They initiated the startup sequences. What happened next was a mechanical catastrophe. Instead of the powerful roar of twin turbine engines, the tarmac echoed with a horrifying metallic sputter. The engines coughed, choked, and died. Black smoke plumed from the exhaust vents, quickly snatched away by the howling wind. One by one, the massive cargo planes failed to ignite. The Federal Aviation Administration mandates strict freeze checks before any commercial flight in extreme conditions. The fleet failed every single parameter. The new cheap mechanics rushed out onto the ice, shivering in their inadequate gear, frantically trying to diagnose the problem. They connected their diagnostic tablets to the aircraft mainframes. The screens displayed a cascade of error messages. The engines were locked out by the onboard computers. My father was a paranoid engineer. He knew the extreme cold could warp engine components and cause catastrophic mid-air failures if the planes were not properly heated and lubricated before flight. To prevent amateur pilots from attempting reckless takeoffs, he installed a proprietary software failsafe. During a deep freeze, the engines required specific encrypted maintenance codes to unlock the ignition sequence. My father took those codes to his grave. The only people who knew how to manually bypass the software locks and safely coax the engines to life were the veteran union mechanics. The exact same mechanics Valerie had arrogantly fired 2 weeks ago to save a few dollars on the operational budget. Panic erupted inside the corporate headquarters. Connor stood by the frozen window, watching the grounded fleet covered in snow. He scrambled to his terminal, trying to contact the fired mechanics. The lines were dead. The men had either changed their numbers or simply ignored the calls, refusing to help the regime that had discarded them. The consequences of their arrogance multiplied exponentially. By noon, the state agencies realized Bush Freight was paralyzed. The governor's office issued a frantic demand for the delayed medical supplies. The corporate lawyers warned Valerie that failure to deliver constituted a massive breach of contract. The financial penalties were staggering, calculating at tens of thousands of dollars per hour. But the fines were the least of her worries. The state attorney general publicly announced an immediate investigation into the company's operational readiness. Endangering remote communities during a declared emergency carried severe criminal negligence charges. Valerie was no longer just losing money. She was looking at potential prison time. The local media caught wind of the crisis. News vans parked outside the corporate gates, their satellite dishes pointed toward the sky, broadcasting the disaster live. The headlines were damning. The legendary Alaskan freight giant was frozen solid under new management. Valerie paced the length of her executive suite, her designer heels sinking into the plush carpet. The smug entitlement was entirely gone, replaced by a raw, primal fear. She turned on Connor, her voice shrill and desperate. "Fix this," she demanded, pointing a manicured finger at his chest. "You are the vice president of operations. You promised me a smooth transition. Get those planes in the air right now, or I will strip your title and leave you bankrupt." Connor backed away, his face pale and slick with sweat. "I cannot fix it, Valerie. We cut the maintenance budgets. The engines are locked out, and the contractors do not know the bypass codes." "Then figure it out," she screamed. Connor's complete lack of actual leadership was exposed for everyone to see. He was a man who thrived in heated boardrooms, summarizing reports and delegating difficult tasks. He possessed zero technical knowledge. He did not know how to turn a wrench or decipher an engine schematic. When faced with a genuine crisis, he simply folded. The empire Valerie stole was not a luxury yacht she could casually pilot from a comfortable deck. It was a heavy, industrial machine that required intense, gritty work to keep moving. She had eagerly grabbed the steering wheel without ever learning how to operate the brakes. The massive liability she inherited was now threatening to crush her entirely. Inside the safety of my off-grid cabin, I watched the chaos unfold on my encrypted monitor. The news feeds showed the grounded planes covered in ice. I poured a cup of hot chicory coffee and sat beside my mother. She watched the broadcast, her expression unreadable. "They are failing, Alida," she observed quietly. "They are drowning, Mom," I replied, "and the water is only getting colder." Valerie was trapped in a nightmare of her own making. She needed a miracle to escape the criminal negligence charges and save her stolen company from total bankruptcy. She needed an escape hatch, and she was willing to do whatever it took to find one. She turned her attention away from her broken fleet and started desperately searching the territory for available cargo planes she could lease or charter. She scoured the logistics networks, looking for any independent operator capable of fulfilling her state contracts. She did not realize that her desperate search was leading her directly into the final, most devastating trap my father and I had ever laid. I stood on the frozen tarmac of a private airfield 50 miles north of Anchorage. The wind whipped the snow into blinding sheets, but I did not stop moving. I wore my heavy, insulated parka, hoisting reinforced crates of medical supplies onto the pristine loading ramp of a Twin Otter aircraft. The smell of aviation fuel mixed with the sharp bite of the Arctic air. Marcus, my chief pilot, stood beside me securing the cargo netting with swift, practiced motions. These were not the broken leased planes sitting dead at the corporate headquarters. Those vehicles were frozen solid under 3 feet of snow due to gross negligence. The aircraft I was loading belonged to the private backup fleet hidden deep within the Compass Group portfolio. My veteran mechanics had winterized these engines to withstand the most punishing drops in temperature. They were ready to fly into the teeth of the storm. I had registered a temporary non-governmental organization hours before the blizzard hit. We operated under a generic philanthropic banner with zero digital ties to my name or my family. To the outside world, we were just a well-funded charity answering the call of duty. Marcus climbed into the cockpit and initiated the pre-flight sequence. The turbines roared to life with a flawless, powerful hum. It was the sound of survival. I stepped back, shielding my face from the icy prop wash. I watched 5 of my private planes taxi down the slick runway and lift off into the whiteout, heading toward Nome Barrow and the isolated coastal villages. They flew the treacherous routes my father had mapped decades ago, navigating by instruments and raw instinct. By nightfall, the diesel generators were humming in remote clinics, and the vital antibiotics were in the hands of rural doctors. The crisis was averted, not by the corporate titan that held the state contracts, but by a ghost fleet operating in the shadows. The media response was instantaneous and fierce. I sat by the iron stove in my cabin watching the evening broadcasts on my encrypted terminal. The state governor held an emergency press conference from the Capitol, praising the anonymous heroes who braved the 100-year blizzard. The governor called the Ghost Fleet a testament to the true Alaskan spirit. In the very next breath, the tone of the press conference turned lethal. The governor officially announced a formal criminal probe into Bush Freight and Aviation. The Attorney General filed charges of gross negligence and reckless endangerment against the executive board. The state suspended their operating licenses pending a full investigation. Valerie was trapped. The local news footage showed her dodging angry reporters outside the downtown headquarters. Her thin designer coat offered zero protection from the freezing microphones shoved in her face. The holding company was paralyzed. The state contracts were breached, and penitentiary time was a very real mathematical probability. She needed a miracle to avoid a prison sentence. She needed working aircraft to fulfill the backlogged deliveries and prove to the state that she was still a capable logistics operator. She scoured the regional aviation channels looking for a lifeline. She saw the news reports featuring the anonymous charity operating out of the secondary airstrip. She saw pristine, winterized cargo planes sitting on the tarmac, resting between emergency supply runs. Valerie did not see a charitable organization rendering aid. She saw unguarded assets. She saw a way out of her nightmare. I monitored the internal corporate communications network, observing her desperate pivot. Valerie cornered Connor in his executive office. She demanded he find a way to commandeer those working aircraft. She wanted to claim the charity planes under the Bush Freight banner, deliver the remaining state cargo, and pretend the entire crisis was just a minor scheduling delay. She wanted to steal the glory and erase her liability in one swift motion. Connor balked at first. He knew that commandeering private property during a state of emergency required executive authorization from the governor. It was a strict legal process. But Valerie threatened to throw him under the bus for the grounded fleet. She reminded him that his signature authorized the maintenance cuts that froze their own planes. She promised to hand him over to the Attorney General unless he found a solution. Connor folded under the pressure. He was terrified of losing his wealth and even more terrified of a prison cell. He logged into the Federal Aviation Dispatch System. Using his outdated administrative credentials, he generated fraudulent operational transfer orders. He fabricated requisition documents claiming the State Emergency Management Agency had authorized Bush Freight to draft the independent fleet into their corporate service. It was a staggering felony. He was forging federal documents to steal private aircraft. Valerie wasted no time executing the theft. She dispatched a team of private security contractors to the secondary airfield, armed with the forged paperwork. I watched the security feed from the airstrip as the contractors marched onto the ice. They presented the fraudulent documents to my ground crew, demanding the keys and the flight logs for 3 of my twin otters. I had already briefed my crew on the strategy. They played their parts perfectly. They feigned outrage, protested the seizure, and then stepped aside, letting the contractors take the planes. Valerie thought she had executed a brilliant, ruthless corporate maneuver. She thought she had outsmarted the system, commandeered working hardware, and saved her stolen empire from the brink of destruction. She did not realize she had just walked directly into a lethal snare. I sat at my wooden table watching the GPS trackers on my private planes move toward the Bush Freight hangars. I picked up my satellite terminal and initiated a secure video link with Zurich. Klaus answered immediately, his expression serious. "I have the final piece of the puzzle," I told him. The shell company just submitted forged federal documents to commandeer my private assets. Klaus accessed the shared digital drive, reviewing the fraudulent transfer orders my ground crew had scanned. He studied the fabricated state seals and the forged signatures. His eyes, they stole directly from the Compass Group. They committed corporate theft against the exact same trust that holds the lease to every single asset they possess. This was the poison pill. By violating the law and stealing from the trust, Valerie had triggered the ultimate default clause in the asset lease agreements. I no longer had to wait for them to miss a financial payment. I had undeniable, documented proof of criminal activity directed at the holding company. They had handed me the legal kill shot. We have total leverage. Klaus confirmed, typing rapidly across his keyboard. I can prepare the termination notices immediately. How do you wish to deliver the final blow? Valerie thinks she has saved her company, I replied. She thinks she has leverage to negotiate with the state and restructure her debts. She is going to look for a buyer or a European bailout to wipe her slate clean. I want you to pose as that bailout, Klaus. Set up a formal meeting in the Anchorage boardroom. Tell her an overseas conglomerate is ready to acquire the company and restructure her liabilities. I watched the fire burn in the iron stove, feeling the heat radiate through the small cabin. The long game was finally over. I had survived the ambush, I had navigated the storm, and I had secured the undeniable proof of their treason. Set the meeting for Friday morning, I instructed. Tell them the chief executive officer of the acquiring firm will attend in person to finalize the documents. It is time to let them see who actually controls the ice. The failed hijack operation sent shockwaves through the executive suite of Bush Freight. The state attorney general did not care about internal corporate politics or weather delays. The governor demanded immediate financial restitution for the breached contracts and the severe endangerment of the remote rural communities. The official deadline was uncompromising. Pay the staggering fines within 48 hours or face immediate arrest warrants for criminal negligence. Valerie found herself backed into a corner she could not manipulate her way out of. Her designer clothes and Seattle high society connections offered zero protection against the fierce Alaskan legal system. She needed an immense influx of liquid capital right now. The problem was undeniable. The operating shell company possessed zero credit. Traditional banks took one look at the plummeting revenue, the grounded fleet, and the pending state investigations and slammed their doors in her face. No reputable financial institution was going to throw a lifeline to a sinking ship piloted by novices. Desperation drove them to the bottom of the financial food chain. Valerie and Connor were forced to seek funding from a predatory private equity firm operating out of a nondescript concrete building in downtown Anchorage. The firm specialized in high-risk distress loans, offering fast cash to desperate businesses at ruinous interest rates. The contrast between this sterile, bleak office and the mahogany boardrooms they were accustomed to was glaring. Valerie sat in a rigid plastic chair, wrapping her silk coat tightly around her shoulders. The heating system rattled overhead, blowing lukewarm air into the cramped room. She took a sip from a cheap styrofoam cup and immediately grimaced. She complained to Connor about the bitter, burnt taste of the coffee. She was moments away from financial execution, but her primary concern was the lack of artisanal espresso. It perfectly encapsulated her profound detachment from reality. Across the scuffed laminate desk sat the equity manager. He was a sharp-eyed man who did not care about the legendary legacy of Richard Bush or the fancy titles printed on their business cards. He only cared about collateral. He slid a thick stack of legal documents toward them. He explained that the corporate entity known as Bush Freight held no tangible assets. The planes were leased, the hangars were leased. Therefore, the company itself was worthless as collateral. To secure the emergency funds necessary to pay off the state and keep themselves out of a jail cell, the lenders required something far more binding. They demanded a personal guarantee. The terms were ruthlessly explicit. To secure the bridge loan, Valerie and Connor had to pledge their personal bank accounts, their future earnings, and every piece of private property they owned. If they defaulted on the repayment, the equity firm had the legal right to bypass the corporate veil and seize their individual assets directly. Connor stared at the signature line, his hands trembling. He hesitated, and a deep, paralyzing fear washed over him. His entire identity was wrapped up in his personal wealth. He had spent years cultivating a pristine image. He lived in a custom-built mansion inside an exclusive gated community. He had imported Italian marble for the foyer and installed heated driveways to keep the harsh winter at bay. His status-obsessed wife, Jessica, stayed with him precisely because of that luxurious insulation. Signing this document put his sanctuary on the chopping block. He looked at Valerie, his voice tight with panic. "We cannot sign this. If the restructuring deal falls through, we lose everything. We will be bankrupt." Valerie slammed her styrofoam cup onto the desk, spilling dark liquid across the laminate surface. She leaned in close, her eyes flashing with desperate fury. "Do not be a coward, Connor. The state attorney general is drafting arrest warrants as we speak. If we do not wire the penalty funds by tomorrow morning, we are both going to prison." She lowered her voice, twisting the knife. "Besides, this is only a temporary measure. We just received an official inquiry from a European conglomerate ready to acquire the company. We use this cash to pay the state fines. We clean up the balance sheet, and we sell the entire operation to the overseas buyer on Friday. It is a bridge loan for 3 days. Sign the paper and secure your future." Connor wiped the sweat from his forehead. He wanted the easy way out. He wanted to believe the illusion that he was just a few days away from a multi-million-dollar buyout. He picked up the cheap plastic pen provided by the lender. He did not read the dense legal clauses detailing the exact mechanics of a default. He simply held his breath and signed his name. Valerie eagerly followed suit, pledging her own inherited wealth to the predatory firm. They handed the documents back, securing the cash injection. They walked out of the concrete building breathing a heavy sigh of relief, believing they had just masterfully navigated their way out of the crisis. They did not understand the true nature of modern digital finance. Hundreds of miles away, inside the silent timber walls of my Matanuska Valley cabin, I was watching the transaction clear in real time. My encrypted satellite terminal cast a steady blue glow across the rustic wooden table. I had a secure audio link established with Zurich. Klaus monitored the banking feeds from his pristine executive office. "The predatory firm in Anchorage has officially issued the emergency funds," he reported, his voice calm and precise. "The state fines have been satisfied. The criminal arrest warrants have been halted. The private equity firm now holds the personal guarantees of both Valerie and Connor." I leaned forward, watching the digital ledgers update on my screen. "Proceed with the acquisition, Klaus. Do not give them a chance to breathe." The counterstrike was swift and entirely invisible. Operating through a labyrinth of untraceable shell corporations, the Compass Group approached the predatory equity firm. Klaus offered them an immediate premium buyout for the specific debt portfolio they had just underwritten. For the Anchorage firm, it was an irresistible proposition. They made a staggering overnight profit without having to assume any of the long-term risks of managing the distress loan. Less than 24 hours after Valerie and Connor signed their lives away, the transaction was finalized. The private equity firm transferred the promissory notes and the personal guarantees to the anonymous European buyer. Klaus sent the confirmation receipt directly to my terminal. I opened the file. There, staring back at me, were the digital copies of their signatures. I traced the erratic lines of Connor's handwriting. He had betrayed our father to steal a crown, and now he had signed away his own castle to keep it. "I own the debt," I stated softly. "We hold the paper," Klaus confirmed. "We control their corporate liabilities and their personal assets." The snare is drawn tight. Back in Anchorage, the usurpers were celebrating. My surveillance network intercepted footage from the executive suite. Valerie and Connor were standing near the expansive windows, looking out over the frozen inlet. They held crystal flutes filled with expensive champagne. They toasted to their survival. They congratulated themselves on outsmarting the state, the weather, and the family they had discarded. They believed the storm had passed. They believed the upcoming Friday boardroom meeting with the anonymous European conglomerate was going to be a lucrative victory lap. They were convinced they were about to walk away with millions of dollars and leave the frozen wasteland behind forever. They were drinking champagne directly under a falling blade. I reached out and closed the lid of my satellite terminal. The screen went dark, leaving the cabin illuminated only by the warm, orange glow of the iron stove. My mother was sitting in her rocking chair, reading a worn paperback novel. She looked peaceful, unaware of the ruthless financial warfare I was waging on her behalf. I stood up and walked over to the frosted window, wiping away a circle of condensation. The 100-year blizzard had finally broken, leaving the valley buried under pristine, undisturbed drifts. The sky was clear and filled with brilliant, sharp stars. The trap was fully set. The corporate treason, the forged hijack orders, the breached asset leases, and the personal financial guarantees were all securely locked inside my digital vault. I had gathered every single weapon necessary to execute a flawless, unanswerable destruction. I turned away from the window and walked toward my heavy winter gear hanging by the door. I needed to prepare my uniform. On Friday morning, the usurpers were expecting a team of foreign investors to hand them a golden parachute. They were going to walk into the grand mahogany boardroom expecting salvation. It was time to leave the wilderness behind, travel back into the heart of the city, and show them exactly who was buying their lives. Friday morning broke clear and brittle over the Matanuska Valley. The historic blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving behind a pristine, frozen landscape. I stepped out of my timber cabin wearing something I had not touched in years. Instead of insulated thermal layers and heavy snow pants, I wore a tailored, charcoal, winter power suit. The fabric was spun from fine Italian wool, designed for executive boardrooms rather than icy tarmacs. I pulled my hair back into a sleek, tight knot. For 29 years, I had played the rugged tomboy hiding in the maintenance hangars. Today, I was dressing for a financial execution. I drove my battered truck toward downtown Anchorage, navigating the freshly plowed highways. The sun reflected blindingly off the snowbanks. My mother remained safely tucked away in the wilderness, reading her novel by the fire. She knew I was traveling into the city to finalize the corporate conflict, but she did not know the sheer magnitude of the trap I was about to spring. I wanted to hand her a total victory wrapped in a tidy bow. Inside the corporate headquarters, the atmosphere was practically vibrating with unearned triumph. My surveillance network provided a crystal-clear audio and visual feed directly to a secure earpiece hidden beneath my hair. I parked 3 blocks away and listened as the usurpers gathered in the grand mahogany boardroom on the top floor. Valerie swept into the room, draped in her signature designer black silk. She tossed her expensive handbag onto the polished wooden table with a dramatic sigh. She looked around the opulent space, displaying overt disgust for the territory that had generated her stolen wealth. "I cannot wait to leave this miserable icebox," she announced to her children. Her voice carried a sharp, haughty edge. "We will sign these restructuring papers, secure the buyout funds, and be on a private jet back to Seattle by dinner. I am scheduling a month-long retreat in Aspen just to thaw out my bones. Alaska is a barbaric wasteland." Trenton slouched in a plush leather chair, swiping through his phone. He was already browsing luxury real estate listings in warmer climates. Brianna sat next to him, applying a fresh coat of shimmering lip gloss, using the dark screen of her tablet as a mirror. They treated the impending multi-million-dollar transaction like a minor inconvenience interrupting their weekend plans. They felt no remorse for the veteran pilots they fired or the remote rural clinics they jeopardized during the storm. They only cared about cashing out. Connor stood near the floor-to-ceiling windows looking out at the frozen inlet. He did not share their relaxed, celebratory mood. He was sweating, despite the efficient climate control humming overhead. His fingers trembled slightly as he reached up to adjust his expensive silk tie, pulling the knot tighter against his throat. Unlike Valerie and her children, Connor actually understood the precarious nature of their current situation. He knew they had pledged their personal bank accounts and private mansions to a predatory lending firm just 48 hours prior. He knew that if this European buyout fell through, he would lose his custom-built home, his pristine reputation, and his status-obsessed wife. He needed this anonymous overseas conglomerate to purchase the company and wipe away the debt. He was betting his entire existence on a blind transaction. Are we certain these foreign investors possess the liquid capital to clear the state fines? Connor asked, his voice tight with lingering panic. Valerie rolled her eyes, dismissing his anxiety with a wave of her manicured hand. Stop worrying, Connor. Our attorneys verified their credentials yesterday. The holding company represents an endless reservoir of European wealth. They acquire distressed logistics networks, restructure the liabilities, and flip them for profit. We are handing them a turnkey operation. They just want our signatures on the transfer deeds. She genuinely believed she held the high ground. She thought she was orchestrating a masterful negotiation. She did not realize the turnkey operation she was selling consisted of leased hardware she did not own and criminal liabilities she could never escape. The heavy oak doors of the boardroom clicked open. The chatter ceased instantly as three men walked into the room. They did not look like the rugged Alaskan businessmen Connor normally dealt with. They were impeccably dressed in bespoke dark navy suits, carrying slim leather briefcases. They radiated an aura of cold, precise discipline. Klaus led the delegation. He offered a brief professional nod to the room, projecting a sterile corporate detachment. "Good morning," he said, his cultured accent cutting through the stale air. "We represent the holding firm. We are here to finalize the acquisition of Bush Freight and Aviation, along with the assumption of all associated corporate and personal liabilities." Valerie flashed a bright, artificial smile, gesturing toward the empty chairs. "Please have a seat, gentlemen. We are eager to conclude this business and finalize the transition." The European lawyers did not sit down. They remained standing, projecting authority. They opened their briefcases and began distributing thick stacks of financial documents across the polished mahogany surface. The papers landed with heavy, authoritative thuds. Connor leaned forward, his eyes scanning the dense legal paragraphs. He was looking for the specific clauses that released him from the disastrous personal guarantee he had signed. He flipped through the pages, breathing a heavy sigh of relief when he spotted the indemnification section. He believed the nightmare was ending. He reached into his suit jacket and produced a silver fountain pen, eager to sign his life over to the strangers. Valerie did not bother reading the contracts. She viewed the paperwork as a mere formality standing between her and her payday. She tapped her polished fingernails against the table, her patience wearing incredibly thin. "These terms seem standard enough," she declared, lifting her chin. "But let us skip the tedious legalese. I want to know the exact timeline for the capital transfer. When precisely will the buyout funds hit my Seattle accounts? I have immediate travel arrangements to finalize, and I do not tolerate banking delays." Klaus stopped arranging the documents. He stood perfectly still, looking at the arrogant woman demanding payment for a stolen kingdom. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and slowly checked his silver pocket watch. The silence in the boardroom stretched, pulling the tension tight like a piano wire. He snapped the watch closed and offered Valerie a thin, chilling smile. "Our holding firm does not authorize remote financial transfers for transactions of this magnitude," Klaus stated, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register. "Our chief executive officer prefers to execute these specific restructuring terms personally." Valerie frowned, her artificial smile faltering. "Your chief executive is flying all the way to Anchorage just to sign a wire transfer?" "She is already here," Klaus replied smoothly. "She possesses a very intimate connection to this organization's history, and she insisted on looking you in the eye before she finalized your accounts." The heavy mahogany doors at the far end of the boardroom did not just open, they swung inward with a deliberate finality. The brass hinges groaned, breaking the suffocating tension inside the room. Every head turned toward the threshold. I stepped over the polished floor. The transition was seamless. For 29 years, this family had only seen me wrapped in heavy insulated parkas and scuffed snow boots. They viewed me as a rugged wilderness coordinator covered in engine grease and frost. That version of me was gone. I walked into the room wearing a tailored charcoal winter power suit. The fabric fell perfectly around my frame. My hair was pulled back into a severe, flawless knot. Instead of the dull, heavy thud of rubber winter boots, my polished leather heels clicked against the hardwood floor with sharp, rhythmic precision. The air in the room seemed to freeze. Valerie stared at me from across the long table. Her initial shock quickly morphed into deep, aristocratic annoyance. She let out a loud, theatrical scoff. She assumed I had driven into the city to beg for a meager allowance. She thought I was there to stage a pathetic emotional protest over the stolen legacy. "What is the meaning of this interruption?" Valerie demanded. Her voice dripped with condescending poison. "We are in the middle of a highly sensitive financial negotiation. You have zero clearance to be on this floor, Alida." I did not break my stride. I kept my eyes focused straight ahead, ignoring her outburst entirely. Trenton slammed his hands flat against the table and stood up. His face flushed raw red with unearned authority. He looked toward the glass walls of the corridor, seeking the private guards his mother had hired. "Security," he shouted. "We need security in here, right now. Remove this woman from the premises before she ruins our transition." Brianna let out a dramatic sigh and crossed her arms. "This is so embarrassing," she muttered, loud enough for the entire room to hear. She just cannot accept that she lost. They waited for the guards to rush in and drag me away. They waited for the European lawyers to express outrage at the uninvited guest. Instead, the exact opposite occurred. Klaus stood up from his chair. The two European attorneys flanking him moved in perfect synchronization. They stood tall, buttoned their dark navy suit jackets, and turned to face me. They did not call for the guards. They lowered their heads in a deep, respectful bow. The gesture was silent, disciplined, and profoundly deferential. The sudden display of loyalty shattered the illusion of control Valerie thought she possessed. Her mouth fell open. Trenton stopped yelling for security, his voice dying in his throat as he looked back and forth between the high-powered foreign investors and his rugged, outcast stepsister. "Good morning, Miss Bush," Klaus said, his tone stripped of the sterile detachment he had used with Valerie. "The transfer documents are prepared for your final authorization." "Thank you, Klaus," I replied. My voice was calm, carrying the steady authority of a person who held all the cards. I walked the remaining length of the room. I bypassed the empty chairs along the sides of the long table. I walked directly toward the head of the board, the chief executive chair, the seat my father had occupied for 3 decades while he built his logistics empire from the frozen ground up. I turned and lowered myself into the plush leather seating. I placed my hands on the polished wood. The silence in the room was deafening. The only sound was the faint hum of the climate control system, pushing warm air through the overhead vents. Valerie looked at me as if I had suddenly grown a second head. The arrogant smirk had vanished from her face, replaced by a creeping, terrifying confusion. I reached into the inner pocket of my charcoal suit jacket. I pulled out the weathered yellow envelope. I laid it flat on the pristine mahogany surface. Then I reached back into my pocket and retrieved the heavy object it had once contained. I set the rusted brass bush-plane compass right next to the envelope. The metal casing clinked sharply against the hard wood. Valerie stared at the tarnished antique. It was the exact same object she had laughed at inside the downtown law office weeks ago. She had called it a toy. She had mocked me for inheriting junk while she inherited millions. Now that same piece of junk was sitting at the head of the boardroom table, flanked by top-tier international attorneys. Connor was sitting halfway down the table. He had remained entirely silent since the doors opened. His eyes were wide, filled with a frantic, calculating panic. He looked at the rusted brass compass resting near my hands. Then his gaze dropped to the thick stack of debt restructuring documents Klaus had placed in front of him just moments prior. He stared at the bold printed letters identifying the anonymous European conglomerate acquiring their lives. The holding firm was officially registered as the Compass Group. I watched the realization hit him in real time. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin the shade of dirty snow. His breathing turned shallow and rapid. He connected the dots. He realized the rusted toy was not a cruel joke. It was a literal map. He realized the foreign investors were not here to save him from the predatory equity loans he had signed. They were the predatory equity. The entire acquisition, the foreign buyout, the promise of millions. It was all a meticulously crafted mirage. Connor opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His hands shook so badly he had to drop his silver fountain pen. It clattered against the table, rolling away from the unsigned documents. Valerie noticed his panic. She looked at her son and then turned her glare back toward me. "I do not understand what kind of sick stunt you are trying to pull, Alida," she sneered, attempting to regain her dominant footing. "These gentlemen are here to purchase my company. You are trespassing." I leaned back in the chief executive chair, steepling my fingers together. I let a slow, predatory smile spread across my face. "You misunderstand the nature of this meeting, Valerie," I said, my voice soft but carrying the lethal weight of an avalanche. "These gentlemen are not here to purchase your company. They work for me. They have worked for me since the day my father passed away." She blinked rapidly, her brain refusing to process the words. "That is impossible," she whispered. "The will gave everything to me. I own Bush Freight." I picked up the rusted compass, turning it over in my palm. "You own a piece of paper," I corrected her. "You own the brand name. You own the employee contracts. You own the public liability. But you do not own the cargo planes. You do not own the shipping yards or the fuel reserves. My father placed every physical asset this operation relies upon into a blind trust 5 years ago. I am the sole beneficiary of that trust. You have been leasing my equipment for the past month." The air rushed out of the room. Trenton sank back into his chair, his confident facade crumbling into dust. Brianna dropped her tablet, the screen cracking against the edge of the desk. Valerie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles turning white. She shook her head in fierce denial. "You are lying. If you owned the assets, you would have evicted us weeks ago. You would not have let us run the operation." "I let you run the operation because I needed you to hang yourselves," I explained calmly, "and you performed beautifully. You slashed the winter maintenance budgets. You fired the veteran pilots. You grounded the fleet during a declared state of emergency and incurred historic breach of contract fines. You proved to the entire state that you are dangerously incompetent." Connor finally found his voice. It was a pathetic, strangled whisper. "The bridge loan," he gasped, staring in horror at the European attorneys. "The emergency cash we took to pay the state fines." I nodded, shifting my gaze to my traitorous brother. "You signed a personal guarantee, Connor. You and Valerie pledged your private bank accounts, your custom-built mansion, and all your future earnings to a predatory lending firm. You needed the cash to avoid prison." I leaned forward, placing both hands flat on the table, closing the distance between us. Less than 24 hours later, the Compass Group purchased that exact debt portfolio. I own your loans. I hold your personal guarantees. You owe $15 million directly to me. The magnitude of their destruction settled over them like a heavy, suffocating shroud. They had walked into the room expecting a golden parachute. Instead, they had walked directly into a financial execution chamber. They possessed zero leverage, zero cash, and zero escapes. The empire they thought they stole was a phantom, and the trap they triggered was very real. "Welcome to my boardroom," I said, sealing their fate. The silence that followed was heavy, pregnant with the realization of total ruin. But financial ruin was only the beginning. The documents resting on the table did not just represent outstanding debts. They represented the key to dismantling their lives, piece by piece. Valerie was about to learn that stealing a legacy was easy, but surviving the wrath of the true heir was a test she could never pass. The realization of their absolute destruction settled over the room like a heavy, suffocating blanket. Valerie sat frozen, staring at the rusted compass resting on the mahogany table. The smug Seattle aristocrat was gone, replaced by a cornered animal realizing the steel jaws of the trap had already snapped shut. A soft chime broke the silence. Brianna's smartphone lit up on the polished wood. Then it chimed again. And again. A rapid, cascading sequence of automated notifications filled the quiet boardroom. She picked up the device, her manicured fingers swiping frantically across the glass screen. I watched her perfectly glossed lips part in silent horror. The corporate credit cards she'd been using to fund her luxury shopping sprees were tied directly to the shell company accounts. My Swiss attorneys had just initiated a total asset freeze. Her digital wallet was instantly voided. Her hands began to tremble, creating a frantic vibration. She dropped the phone. It clattered against the desk, displaying a bright red banner reading, "Transaction declined." I did not raise my voice. I did not need to yell to command the room. I dissected their catastrophic failure with surgical precision. When you signed that predatory bridge loan, you pledged your personal wealth as collateral, I reminded them. You assumed it was a safe bet because you planned to sell Bush Freight and Aviation to a foreign buyer today. But you cannot sell an entity that holds zero equity. The moment you defaulted on my lease agreements, your operating shell became legally insolvent. Valerie shook her head, her breathing turning shallow and erratic. We did not default, she insisted, her voice cracking under the mounting pressure. We missed zero financial payments. You violated the fundamental safety clauses. I corrected her, leaning back in the executive chair. You fired the union mechanics and grounded the fleet during a declared state of emergency. That alone triggered the termination protocols. But your true fatal error was much darker than simple incompetence. I reached into the slim leather briefcase Klaus had placed beside me. I pulled out a stack of Federal Dispatch records and slid them down the length of the table. They stopped directly in front of Connor. He stared at the documents, his eyes widening in pure terror. 3 days ago, Valerie instructed you to commandeer working aircraft from an anonymous rural charity, I said, pacing my words carefully to ensure every syllable landed like a hammer strike. You accessed the Federal Aviation database using outdated administrative credentials. You generated fraudulent transfer orders claiming the State Emergency Management Agency authorized the seizure. You sent private security contractors to an airstrip to steal 3 Twin Otter planes. Trenton swallowed hard, sinking lower into his plush chair. We needed those planes to fulfill the medical contracts, he muttered, trying to justify the blatant theft. You stole them from me, I stated flatly. That anonymous charity was a temporary philanthropic front, operated by the Compass Group. The aircraft you attempted to hijack belonged to my private reserve fleet. You committed grand theft aviation and federal fraud against your own landlord. Because of these documented criminal breaches, the terms of your personal guarantee are instantly accelerated, I announced. The $15 million emergency loan is no longer a structured debt. It is due payable in full right this very second. Since you cannot produce the liquid capital, you are bankrupt. My holding firm is currently seizing your bank accounts, your investment portfolios, and every piece of private property tied to your signatures. The immaculate corporate armor Connor wore his entire adult life finally shattered. He slumped forward, resting his elbows on the table, and buried his face in his hands. When he looked up, tears were streaming down his cheeks, ruining his polished executive image. "Alida, please," he begged, his voice a pathetic broken whimper. "You cannot do this. If you call in that loan, I lose everything. Jessica will leave me. I will lose my home. We are blood, Alida. We share a father. You have to show some mercy. We are family." The sheer audacity of his plea echoed through the silent boardroom. I looked at the golden child who had traded 3 decades of shared history for a corner office. I reached into my charcoal suit jacket and produced the final piece of paper. I unfolded the hard copy of the encrypted email I had extracted from his laptop weeks ago. I slid the printed message across the table. Connor looked down at his own words from 6 months prior, where he explicitly agreed to sabotage our father and blindside our mother in exchange for the chief executive title. "Business is business, Connor," I said, echoing the exact phrase he used when he abandoned me in his heated foyer. "You traded your family for a promotion. You sold your loyalty for a tailored suit and a high salary. You are fired. Gather your personal items and vacate the premises. My attorneys are filing the foreclosure paperwork on your custom mansion as we speak." Valerie shot up from her seat, her chair tipping backward and crashing to the floor. "You cannot do this," she screamed, her composure shattered into jagged pieces. "This is illegal. You set us up." "I am Richard Bush's legal wife. I am going to sue you for everything you own. I will drag you through the federal courts for decades." Klaus stepped forward, his expression as cold as alpine snow. He opened his briefcase and unloaded a thick, heavy binder onto the table. It landed with a resounding thud. "You are welcome to attempt litigation, Mrs. Bush," Klaus said, his cultured accent dripping with clinical disdain. Within this binder are 24 ironclad legal precedents confirming the absolute validity of the Compass Group structure. It also contains the irrefutable evidence of your federal fraud. If you initiate a civil lawsuit, we will turn these forged dispatch records over to the state attorney general. You will trade a bankruptcy hearing for a federal prison cell. The choice is yours. Valerie stared at the binder, the last remaining embers of her defiance extinguishing in an instant. She was beaten. The Seattle aristocrat who marched into St. Jude's sanctuary expecting to conquer an empire was leaving with nothing but the clothes on her back. The heavy mahogany doors at the end of the boardroom opened once again. The private security guards Trenton had summoned earlier finally arrived. They wore tactical uniforms and carried themselves with stern authority. They looked at the chaotic scene, expecting to remove a trespassing wilderness coordinator. Klaus turned to the lead guard, projecting absolute command. "The individuals sitting on that side of the table are no longer authorized personnel. They have been terminated. Please escort them from the building immediately. Ensure they leave their corporate keys and access badges at the front desk." The guards hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking at Connor for confirmation. Connor did not say a word. He stood up, his shoulders slumped, and walked toward the exit like a condemned man. Trenton and Brianna followed him, their faces pale, their designer clothes suddenly looking absurdly out of place. Valerie lingered near the table, glaring at me with a toxic mixture of hatred and profound defeat. She had underestimated the harsh reality of the North. She thought she could survive the winter without learning how to build a fire. I picked up the rusted brass compass, holding it in the palm of my hand. "Safe travels back to Seattle, Valerie," I said, my voice steady and cold. "Do not miss your flight." She turned on her heel and marched out of the boardroom, flanked by the security team. The heavy doors clicked shut behind them, sealing their exile. The grand executive suite was finally quiet. The suffocating presence of the usurpers was gone, replaced by the crisp, clean air of a hard-won victory. I sat alone at the head of the long, polished table, surrounded by my loyal Swiss attorneys. I had defended the perimeter. I had outmaneuvered the traitors and reclaimed the logistics empire my father built. The financial and operational war was officially over. Yet as I looked at the empty chairs, I knew the work was not finished. The corporate parasites were removed, but the emotional wreckage they left behind still needed tending. My mother was sitting inside a drafty, off-grid timber cabin miles away in the Matanuska Valley. She had been humiliated, stripped of her identity, and banished from the home she loved. Winning the boardroom was the logical victory. Restoring her dignity was the moral imperative. It was time to retrieve the rightful matriarch and bring her back to the mountain. The heavy boardroom doors clicked shut, sealing the fate of the usurpers. I stood alone in the grand mahogany room for a long moment, letting the profound silence wash over me. Klaus and the European legal team packed their pristine briefcases with quiet efficiency. They had executed their roles flawlessly, projecting the exact aura of intimidating corporate power I required to spring the trap. I thanked them for their precise service. They bowed their heads in respectful acknowledgement before exiting the suite, leaving me to govern the territory I had just conquered. My first order of business was not reviewing the profit ledgers or examining the new stock valuations. It was stopping the operational bleeding. I walked over to the sleek digital console resting on the expansive table and picked up the receiver. I dialed a familiar secure number. Marcus answered on the second ring. The chief pilot sounded exhausted, his voice rough from days of managing the Ghost Fleet during the historic blizzard. I told him the siege was officially over. I instructed him to mobilize every veteran mechanic and union pilot we had placed on the Shadow payroll. They were coming home. I authorized a generous hazard bonus for every individual who stood by my side during the dark weeks of the transition, drawing the funds directly from the deep liquid accounts of the Swiss Trust. I told Marcus to march his crews right past the bewildered private security guards and retake control of the primary hangars. The backup planes would merge seamlessly back into the official Bush freight network by midnight. The true Alaskan supply chain was roaring back to life. With the mechanical crisis resolved, I turned my focus to the most vital task of the day. My mother was still sitting inside a tiny off-grid timber shelter, unaware that the world had fundamentally shifted. She believed we were exiled outcasts, hiding from a predatory Seattle aristocrat. It was time to bring the matriarch in from the cold. I called a premium private transport service operating out of downtown Anchorage. I ordered their finest heated luxury vehicle, outfitting the interior with thick thermal blankets and instructing the driver to navigate the icy Matanuska Valley roads with extreme care. The driver accepted the premium rate and headed north toward our frozen sanctuary. While the transport navigated the wilderness, I called for the corporate facilities team. I ordered them to strip the top-floor executive suite of every single arrogant trace Valerie and her children had left behind. The pretentious modern art was pulled from the walls. The ridiculous ergonomic chairs were hauled away to a basement storage locker. Trenton had left his bright white designer parka draped across a leather sofa. I instructed the janitorial staff to throw it directly into the nearest industrial dumpster. I restored the room to its original functional elegance, honoring the gritty reality of the freight industry. The luxury vehicle arrived at the remote cabin just as the afternoon sun began to dip below the jagged horizon. My surveillance feed chimed, verifying the pickup. My mother stepped out into the freezing wind, clutching her modest winter coat against her chest. She looked confused by the pristine black vehicle idling near the chopped wood pile, but the driver greeted her by name and opened the heavy armored door. She climbed into the plush, heated interior, leaving the harsh isolation of the timber structure behind. I waited for her inside the pinnacle of my new domain. The top-floor executive suite offered an unparalleled panoramic view of the Chugach Peaks. When the private elevator chimed and the polished steel doors parted, my mother stepped onto the executive floor, looking hesitant and bewildered. She scanned the long hallway, expecting to see Valerie glaring at her from a corner office. Instead, she saw me, standing tall in my tailored charcoal suit. I walked over and gently guided her into the spacious office. I directed her to the plush leather chair positioned behind the grand mahogany desk, the very seat her husband had occupied for 3 decades. I handed her a steaming porcelain cup of rich, hot cocoa. She wrapped her cold hands around the warm ceramic, letting the heat seep into her skin. She sat in silence, looking out the floor-to-ceiling windows, viewing the majestic snow-capped ranges she thought she had lost forever. I sat across from her and began to speak. I told her the entire, unvarnished truth. I explained the intricate architecture of the blind trust and the hidden wealth generating revenue overseas. I described the rusted brass compass, the frozen aviation bunker, and the encrypted satellite terminal I used to communicate with Zurich. I laid out the mechanics of the trap, detailing how Valerie had walked blindly into an inescapable financial snare by hijacking our private planes. Her eyes widened as the pieces of my father's complex puzzle finally snapped together. She listened closely as I revealed the depth of the betrayal Connor had orchestrated. The pain of her son's treason was sharp, but the revelation of her husband's profound loyalty provided a soothing balm. She realized Richard had not abandoned her to the wolves. He had protected her the only way he could, knowing the enemy was already inside the gates. He trusted his rugged wilderness coordinator daughter to weather the storm, decode the map, and execute the final lethal counterstrike. "You saved us, Alida," my mother whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You fought an entire army, and you won." "We won," I corrected her, offering a gentle smile. "But this office is just a place for business. It is a place for signing contracts and managing fleets. It is not a place for healing. We have one more stop to make tonight." I took her empty porcelain cup and offered my arm. We walked back to the private elevator, descending to the secure, heated parking garage where my own vehicle waited. We drove out of the downtown grid, leaving the towering glass buildings behind. I steered the truck toward the sprawling foothills overlooking the city, following the winding, familiar roads we had driven 1,000 times before. We pulled into the circular driveway of the Grand Mountain Estate. The commercial moving trucks that had hauled our lives away were long gone. The property stood quiet and serene under the twilight sky, surrounded by towering spruce trees heavy with fresh snow. Warm yellow light spilled from the front windows, casting a welcoming glow across the pristine drifts. I had ordered an advance team to restore our personal belongings to their rightful places. I walked my mother up the wide stone steps to the heavy oak front door. I did not reach for my keys. I stopped on the threshold and turned to face her. I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket and withdrew a thick vellum document sealed in a protective leather folio. I placed the heavy folder directly into her trembling hands. It was the official property deed to the estate. The predatory loans and the ancient corporate liens were extinguished. The mortgage was paid in full, drawing from the vast liquid reserves of the Swiss accounts. The title was irrevocably registered in her name alone. No holding firm, no corrupt executive, and no bitter rival could ever threaten to evict her again. She owned the mountain. Susan looked down at the dense legal text, tracing the embossed ink with her fingers. The stoic mask she had worn since the horrific day of the funeral finally cracked. The walls she built to survive the cold shattered into a million pieces. Tears spilled over her eyelashes, falling onto the leather folio. She wept openly under the darkening Alaskan sky. Yet these were not tears of hollow grief or lingering betrayal. They were tears of overwhelming, radiant pride. She wept because she was standing in the doorway of her reclaimed sanctuary. She wept because she saw the unbreakable strength I had forged in the ice. She looked up at me, her eyes shining with pure validation. I wrapped my arms around her, holding her tight against the crisp evening air. The emotional core of our family was fully restored. I had vanquished the parasites and secured the logistics empire. I had proven that a true legacy is never inherited through a forged signature or a secret divorce decree. It is earned through resilience. We stepped inside the warm, familiar foyer, ready to reclaim the life that was violently interrupted. The fierce winds outside no longer posed a threat to our existence. I had mastered the storm. But securing a crown is merely the first step of ruling a territory. The true test of enduring power is determined by the empire you build after the ashes finally cool. 3 years have passed since the heavy mahogany doors of the Anchorage boardroom closed on the usurpers. Time moves differently in the north. It hardens the ice and sharpens the stone. Today, the Compass Group is no longer a hidden shadow trust operating behind leased assets. It is a recognized titan dominating the logistics network across the entire Arctic Circle. We expanded beyond Alaskan borders, establishing permanent supply lines through the Yukon and navigating the treacherous routes of the Northwest Passage. I sit at the head of the polished table inside the top-floor executive suite. The morning sun reflects brilliantly off the Chugach peaks, casting a crisp white glow across my desk. My chief pilot Marcus stands nearby, holding a thick leather folder. He places a sprawling logistics contract in front of me. It outlines a historic partnership with the federal government to construct a network of all-weather medical hubs across the deep tundra. I pick up a silver fountain pen and sign my name on the dotted line. A sudden draft from the ventilation system threatens to blow the pages away. I reach out and place a familiar, heavy object on top of the crisp parchment. The rusted brass bushplane compass pins the document in place. The needle remains permanently stuck off-kilter, magnetized to a frequency only my father and I ever knew. It serves as an excellent paperweight and a constant reminder of the arduous journey through the storm. The wealth generated by the fleet serves a distinct purpose. It secures the foundation of our legacy. My mother Susan thrives in her reclaimed sanctuary. The sprawling mountain estate, once packed into cardboard boxes by impatient movers, now hosts vibrant charity galas. She founded a philanthropic trust dedicated to funding winter survival programs for indigenous communities and providing scholarships for young women entering the aviation field. She no longer wears the stoic, hollow expression that haunted her during the bitter days of the transition. Her eyes sparkle with renewed purpose. She tends to the spruce trees lining the circular driveway, ensuring their roots grow deep and strong. She survived the sudden erasure of her past by forging an undeniable future. The woman who was told to vacate her own home within 30 days now dictates the philanthropic heartbeat of the entire territory. Her grace is a quiet rebellion against the people who tried to render her invisible. Justice in the corporate world is rarely poetic, but occasionally it achieves a perfect freezing symmetry. The financial guillotine I dropped 3 years ago severed Valerie from her aristocratic illusions permanently. The emergency bridge loan defaulted, sweeping away her hidden bank accounts, her luxury vehicles, and her pristine Seattle real estate. The bankruptcy court seized every asset tied to her signature, leaving her destitute. She now resides in a cramped, damp studio apartment on the industrial outskirts of Seattle. The relentless gray rain taps against a single cracked window pane overlooking a dark alleyway. There are no silk coats or designer stilettos in her closet. She works early morning shifts at a discount retail store, folding garments under harsh fluorescent lights. Her hands, once adorned with expensive jewelry, are now rough from hauling heavy inventory boxes. Trenton shares the same dismal fate. The young man who once posted arrogant photographs bragging about conquering the frontier now stands behind a cash register at a local pharmacy. He wears a synthetic uniform, scanning barcodes and bagging toothpaste for minimum wage. They spend their evenings arguing over utility bills, trapped in a miserable cage they locked from the inside. The millions they thought they stole evaporated, leaving them to face the brutal reality of the working class they used to mock. Then there is Connor. The brother who traded his bloodline for a corner office learned a brutal lesson about the loyalty of fair-weather companions. The exact day the banks foreclosed on his custom-built mansion, his status-obsessed wife Jessica packed her imported leather bags. She filed for divorce before the moving trucks even cleared the heated driveway, taking whatever liquid scraps her attorneys managed to shield from the wreckage. Connor did not find salvation in the executive job market. The industry quickly learned the truth behind the historic Anchorage blizzard. The logistics world is small and unforgiving toward cowards who forge federal documents and freeze their own fleets. No reputable firm would hire a liability. The man who dreamed of being a chief executive officer was blacklisted across the state. He now works as a mid-level shift manager at a sprawling big-box hardware store in the Anchorage suburbs. He spends his days walking down aisles of PVC piping and heavy-duty snow shovels, wearing a bright orange vest. He sweeps the floors and restocks the shelves, answering to teenage supervisors who do not care about his Ivy League business degree. Sometimes, during his meager lunch break, he steps out into the freezing parking lot, holding a cheap paper cup of bitter coffee. He looks up at the bruised winter sky, watching the heavy Twin Otter cargo planes ascending through the clouds, carrying my company logo painted bright and bold on their tails. He knows he could have been standing beside me, commanding the sky. Instead, he sold his soul for a title that blew away in the wind. He must live with that agonizing treason every single day, knowing his punishment was entirely self-inflicted. I stand up from the executive desk and walk toward the floor-to-ceiling windows. The Alaskan wilderness stretches out endlessly before me, vast, untamed, and breathtaking. My father built this kingdom by respecting the raw reality of the ice. He knew that predators would eventually circle the perimeter, looking for an easy meal. He designed a trial that could only be passed by someone willing to walk into the freezing void and earn their survival. A piece of paper, whether it is a forged will, a secret divorce decree, or a hollow corporate title, does not grant you true power. A crown stolen in the shadows will always turn to dust in the harsh light of day. Real authority is forged in the fire of adversity. It is earned through unwavering loyalty, unyielding resilience, and the quiet courage required to navigate the darkest storms. The usurpers tried to bury me in the snow, assuming I would freeze and fade away quietly into the night. They forgot that the cold is my native language. I am Alida Bush, and I hold the sky. Thank you for listening to this journey on Sophia Told Stories. If my battle against betrayal resonated with your spirit, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment below sharing a time you proved your doubters wrong and reclaimed your own power. Never let anyone dictate your worth, and always remember to trust your inner compass. I will see you in the next story.
The icy wind whistling through the Matanuska Valley isn't just a weather phenomenon. It's a crucible. It's a force that strips away pretense and demands authenticity. The story of the Bush family, played out against the unforgiving backdrop of the Alaskan wilderness, serves as a stark, modern parable about what we truly owe our children. It's a narrative that forces us to look past the superficial trappings of success and examine the bedrock of our parenting. Are we raising children equipped to navigate the storms? Or are we simply insulating them in glass houses, destined to shatter at the first sign of a real freeze? In the heart of American culture, the self-made myth often overshadows the profound, quiet labor of parenting. We strive to provide for our children, working long hours to secure the best schools, the safest neighborhoods, and the most comfortable lives. We build our own versions of Richard Bush's empire, hoping to leave a legacy. Yet the central tragedy of the Bush family wasn't the loss of a multi-million-dollar company. It was the realization that the empire had been built on a fractured foundation. The true legacy wasn't the fleet of cargo planes. It was the distinct, diverging paths of Richard's children. Consider the compass. It's perhaps the most striking symbol in the entire narrative. When Alida sat in that mahogany-paneled law office, surrounded by the triumphant smirks of her father's secret family and the cowardice of her brother, she was handed what appeared to be an insult, a rusted, jammed piece of antique brass. In a society obsessed with immediate inheritance, stock portfolios, and trust funds, a broken compass seems worse than nothing. It feels like a dismissal. But Richard Bush understood something fundamental about survival. He didn't leave his daughter the keys to a kingdom she hadn't earned. He left her a tool that only she, with her unique set of skills and resilience, could decipher. He left her a test. This is the essence of true parental provision. It is the painful, necessary shift from handing our children the fish to teaching them how to fish, or, in Alida's case, how to navigate a whiteout blizzard to find the hidden bunker. As parents, our instinct is often to shield our children from hardship. We want to smooth the path, remove the obstacles, and ensure they never have to experience the biting cold of failure or disappointment. We raise children like Trenton and Brianna, wrapped in designer parkas that have never seen actual snow, believing that comfort equates to capability. But when the metaphorical, or literal, storm hits, when the engines freeze and the easy answers evaporate, comfort is useless. The children who survive, who thrive, are the ones who have been allowed to experience the wilderness. They are the ones who have learned, through trial and error, how to build a fire, read the barometric pressure, and trust their own instincts. The contrast between Alida and her brother Connor is a devastating exploration of morality versus ambition. Connor was the golden child, the one groomed for the executive suite. He had the Ivy League education, the tailored suits, and the corner office. Yet when faced with a choice between loyalty to his mother and the promise of ultimate power, he chose betrayal. He orchestrated a treason so deep it shattered the family's core. Connor's failure isn't just a lapse in judgment, it's a failure of moral education. In our drive to raise successful, competitive children, do we inadvertently neglect the foundational values of integrity and fairness? Do we teach them that business is business justifies any cruelty? The story reminds us that an education lacking compassion and a moral compass will inevitably lead to collapse when faced with the seduction of power. Betrayal might yield a temporary corner office, but integrity is the only currency that sustains a lasting legacy. We must consciously teach our children that true success isn't measured by the title on a door, but by the loyalty they show to the people who raised them and the values they uphold when no one is watching. Furthermore, the narrative underscores the profound importance of emotional awareness and respect for roots. Alida's ultimate triumph wasn't just a matter of uncovering Swiss bank accounts. Her strength was deeply connected to her respect for the people who actually built the empire, the veteran pilots and mechanics that the usurpers so casually discarded. She valued the gritty reality of the work and the people who performed it. Conversely, Valerie and her children failed precisely because of their arrogance and their complete disregard for the core values and practical knowledge required to survive in that environment. This speaks to a crucial aspect of parenting within a traditional family structure: teaching gratitude. We must instill in our children an appreciation for the sacrifices of those who came before them. The connection to tradition, the honoring of enduring family values, like Alida's fierce determination to restore her mother's home, is the greatest source of spiritual strength a child can possess. A child disconnected from their roots, who views legacy only as an ATM, is a child adrift, vulnerable to the first crisis that requires genuine substance. Raising children in today's complex, fast-paced world is an arduous task. It requires a delicate balance of providing security while allowing for necessary struggle. It demands that we prioritize honesty over appearances, fairness over advantage, and emotional resilience over superficial success. We must be willing to let our children face the cold, to hand them the rusted compass instead of the easy map, knowing that the skills they forge in the wilderness are the only things that will truly protect them. The story of the Bush family is a mirror reflecting our own choices. It asks us to consider what we are truly leaving behind. Are we building empires of paper and leased assets, vulnerable to the slightest shift in the wind? Or are we building fortresses of character, forged in the quiet, consistent lessons of loyalty, resilience, and hard work? As you reflect on the choices you are making for your own family, I encourage you to join our community. Please follow and subscribe to Sophia Told Stories for more narratives that explore the deep, often hidden currents of family, legacy, and the human spirit. We delve into the stories that challenge us, inspire us, and ultimately help us understand ourselves better. When the snow settles and the wind finally stops howling, what remains isn't the wealth we accumulated or the titles we held. What remains is the character of the people we raised. We look at our children, and in their actions, we see the true measure of our lives. The compass we hand them may be weathered, it may be difficult to read, but if we have taught them well, it will always point them toward their true north. The question isn't whether the storm will come. It always does. The only question that matters is, when the ice cracks and the lights go out, Who have we prepared them to be?